Chapter 52 of Half a Century by Jane Grey SWISSHELM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Find work. That evening I wrote to the New York Tribune relating the incident of the man asking for cooling drinks, and saying that if people furnished the material, I would devote my time to distributing their gifts. Next morning I got 24 lemons, pressed the juice into a jar, put in sugar, took a glass and spoon, and so soon as visitors were admitted, began giving lemonade to those men who seemed to have most need. Going to the water tank for every glass of water made it slow work, but I improved my walks by talking to the men, hearing their wants and adding to their stock of hope and cheerfulness, and was glad to see that the nurses did not seem to object to my presence, even though Campbell was the one only hospital in the city from which female nurses were rigorously excluded. So noted had it become for the masculine pride of its management that I had been warned not to stay past the length of an ordinary visit, lest I should be roughly told to go away, and my surprise was equal to my pleasure when a man came and said, "Would it not be easier for you if you had a pitcher?" I said it would, but that I lived too far away to bring one. "Oh, I will bring you a pitcher. Why did you not ask for one?" "I did not want to trouble you, for they told me you did not like to have women here." He laughed and said, "I guess we'll all be glad enough to have you. Not many of your sort. First thing they all do is begin to make trouble, and it always takes 2 men to wait on one of them." He brought the pitcher, and I felt that I was getting on in the world. Still I was very humble, and careful to win the favor of the King's Chamberlain, those potencies, the nurses, who might report me to that royal woman-hater Dr. Baxter, surgeon in charge, whose name was a terror to women who intruded themselves into military hospitals. As I passed with my pitcher, I saw one man delirious and expectorating profusely, a matter green as grass could be, knew this was hospital gangrene, and remembered all Dr. Palmer had told me years before of his experience in Paris hospitals, and the antidotes to that and scurvy poison. Indeed, the results of many conversations with first-class physicians, and of some reading on the subject of camp diseases, came to me, and I knew just what was wanted here, but saw no sign that the want was likely to be supplied. For this man it was too late, but I could not see that anything was being done to prevent the spread of this fearful scourge. Passing from that ward into the one adjoining, I came suddenly upon 2 nurses dressing a thigh stump, while the patient filled the air with half-suppressed shrieks and groans. I had never before seen a stump, but remembered Dr. Jackson's lecture over the watermelon at dessert on amputation, for the benefit of Charles Sumner, and electricity never brought light quicker. Then there came to me the memory of all he had said about the proper arrangement of the muscles over the end of the bone, and added to this came a perfect knowledge of the relations of those mangled muscles to the general form of the body. I saw that the nurse who held the stump tortured the man by disregarding natural law, and setting down pitcher and glass on the floor, I stepped up, knelt, slipped my hands under the remains of that strong thigh, and said to the man who held it, "Now slip out your hands, easy, easy there." The instant it rested on my hands, the groans ceased, and I said, "Is that better?" "Oh, my God, yes." "Well, then, I will always hold it when it is dressed." "But you will not be here." "I will come." "That would be too much trouble." "I have nothing else to do, and will think it no trouble." The nurse who did the dressing was very gentle, and there was no more pain, but I saw that the other leg was amputated below the knee, and this was a double reason why he should be tenderly cared for. So I took the nurse aside and asked when the wounds were to be dressed again. He said in the morning, and promised to wait until I came to help. Next morning I was so much afraid of being late that I would not wait for the street cars to begin running, and walked. The guard objected to admitting me, as it was not time for visitors, but I explained, and he let me pass. I must not go through the wards at that hour, so I went around and came in by the door near which he lay. What was my surprise to find that not only were his wounds dressed, but that his clothing and bed had been changed, and everything about him made as white and neat and square as if he were a corpse, which he more resembled than a living man. Oh, what a tribute of agony he had paid to the demon of appearance! We all pay heavy taxes to other people's eyes, but on none is the levy quite so onerous as on the patients of a model hospital. I saw that he had breathed and slept, and knew his time was short, but sought the head nurse and asked why he had not waited for me. He hesitated, stammered, blushed, and said, "Why, the fact is, sister, he has another wound that it would not be pleasant for you to see." "Do you mean that that man has a groin wound in addition to all else?" "Yes, sister, yes, and I thought—" "No matter what you thought. You have tortured him to save your mock modesty and mine. You could have dressed that other wound, covered him, and let me hold the stump. You saw what relief it gave him yesterday. How could you? How dare you torture him?" "Well, sister, I have been in hospitals with sisters a great deal, and they never help to dress wounds. I thought you would not get leave to come, would not like to. I am not a sister, I am a mother, and that man had suffered enough. Oh, how dared you do such a thing?" I wrung my hands, and he trembled like a leaf and said, "It was wrong, but I did not know. I never saw a sister before. I tell you I am no sister, and I cannot think whatever your sisters are good for." He promised to let me help him whenever it would save pain, and I returned to the dying man. The sun shone and birds sang. He stirred, opened his eyes, smiled to see me, and said, "It is a lovely morning, and I will soon be gone." I said, "Yes, the winter of your life is past. For you the reign of sorrow is over and gone. The springtime appears on the earth, and the time for the singing of birds has come. Your immortal summer is close at hand. Christ, who loveth us and has suffered for us, has prepared mansions of rest for those who love him, and you are going soon. Oh, yes, I know he will take me home and provide for my wife and children when I am gone. Then all is well with you." He told me his name and residence in Pittsburgh, and I remembered that his parents lived our near neighbors when I was a child. So more than ever I regretted that I could not have made his passage through the dark valley one of less pain, but it was a comfort to his wife to know I had been with him. When he slept again, I got a slightly wounded man to sit by him and keep away the flies, while I went to distribute some delicacies brought to him by visitors and which he would never need. At the door of Ward 3 a large man stood, and seemed to be an officer. I asked him if there were any patients in that ward who would need wine penado. He looked down at me pleasantly and said, "I think it very likely, madam, for it is a very bad ward." It was indeed a very bad ward, for a settled gloom lay upon the faces of the occupants, who suffered because the ward master and entire set of nurses had recently been discharged, and new incompetent men appointed in their places. As I passed down, turning from right to left to give to such men as needed it the mild stimulant I had brought, I saw how sad and hopeless they were. Only one man seemed inclined to talk, and he sat near the center of the ward, while someone dressed his shoulder, from which the arm had been carried away by a cannon ball. A group of men stood around him talking of that strange amputation, and he was full of chat and cheerfulness. They called him Charlie, but my attention was quickly drawn to a young man on a cot close by who was suffering torture from the awkwardness of a nurse who was dressing a large flesh wound on the outside of his right thigh. I set my bowl on the floor, caught the nurse's wrist, lifted his hand away, and said, "Oh, stop, you are hurting that man, let me do that." He replied pleasantly, "I'll be very glad to, for I'm a green hand." I took his place and saw the wounded flesh creep at the touch of cold water, and said, "Cold water hurts you?" "Yes, ma'am, a little." "Then we must have some warmth." But nurse said there was none. "No warm water?" I exclaimed, as I drew back and looked at him in blank astonishment. "No, ma'am, there is no warm water." "How many wounded men have you in this hospital?" "Well, about 700, I believe." "About 700 wounded men, and no warm water, so none of them get anything to eat?" "Oh, yes, they get plenty to eat." "And how do you cook without warm water?" "Why, there's plenty of hot water in the kitchen, but we're not allowed to go there, and we have none in the wards." "And where is the kitchen?" He directed me. I covered the wound, told the patient to wait, and I would get warm water. In the kitchen, a dozen cooks stopped to stare at me, but one gave me what I came for, and on returning to the ward I said to Charlie, "Now you can have some warm water if you want it." "But I do not want it. I like cold water best." "Then it is best for you, but it is not best for this man." I had never before seen any such wound as the one I was dressing, but I could think of but one way: clean it thoroughly, put on clean lint and rags and bandages without hurting the patient, and this was very easy to do. But while I did it, I wanted to do something more, that is, dispel the gloom which hung over the ward. I knew that sick folks should have their minds occupied by pleasant thoughts, and never addressed an audience with more care than I talked to that one man, in appearance, while really talking to all those who lay before me, and some to whom my back was turned. I could modulate my voice so as to be heard at quite a distance, and yet cause no jar to very sensitive ears close at hand, and when I told my patient that I proposed to punish him now while he was in my power, all heard and wondered. Then everyone was stimulated to learn that it was to keep him humble, because having received such a wound in the charge on Marie's Hill, he would be so proud by and by that common folks would be afraid to speak to him. I should be quite thrown into the shade by his laurels, and should probably take my revenge in advance by sticking pins in him now when he could not help himself. This idea proved to be quite amusing, and before I had secured that bandage, the men seemed to have forgotten their wounds, except as a source of future pride, and were firing jokes at each other as rapidly as they had done bullets at the enemy. When, therefore, I proposed sticking pins into any one else who desired such punishment, there was quite a demand for my services, and with my basin of tepid water I started to wet the hard, dry dressings, and leave them to soften before being removed. Before night I discovered that lint is an instrument of incalculable torture, and should never be used, as either blood or pus quickly converts some portion of it into splints as irritating as a pine shaving. End of chapter 52. Chapter 53 of Half a Century by Jane Grey SWISSHELM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Hospital, Gangrene. About 9 o'clock I returned to the man I had come to help and found that he still slept. I hoped he might rouse and have some further message for his wife before death had finished his work, and so remained with him, although I was much needed in the very bad ward. I had sat by him but a few moments when I noticed a green shade on his face. It darkened, and his breathing grew labored, then ceased. I think it was not more than 20 minutes from the time I observed the green tinge until he was gone. I called the nurse, who brought the large man I had seen at the door of the bad ward, and now I knew he was a surgeon, knew also by the sudden shadow on his face when he saw the corpse that he was alarmed, and when he had given minute directions for the removal of the bed and its contents, the washing of the floor and sprinkling with chloride of lime, I went close to his side and said in a low voice, "Doctor, is not this hospital gangrene?" He looked down at me, seemed to take my measure, and answered, "I am very sorry to say, madam, that it is." "Then you want lemons. We would be glad to have them." "Glad to have them," I repeated in profound astonishment. "Why, you must have them." He seemed surprised at my earnestness, and set about explaining. "We sent to the Sanitary Commission last week and got half a box." "Sanitary Commission, and half a box of lemons. How many wounded have you?" 750. 750 wounded men, hospital gangrene, and half a box of lemons. Well, that was all we could get. Government provides none, but our chaplain is from Boston. His wife has written to friends there and expects a box next week. To Boston for a box of lemons. I went to the head nurse, whom I had scolded in the morning, who now gave me writing materials, and I wrote a short note to the New York Tribune. Hospital gangrene has broken out in Washington, and we want lemons, 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 lemons. No man or woman in health has a right to a glass of lemonade until these men have all they need. Send us lemons. I signed my name and mailed it immediately, and it appeared next morning. That day Schuyler Colfax sent a box to my lodgings and $5 in a note bidding me send to him if more were wanting. But that day lemons began to pour into Washington, and soon I think into every hospital in the land. Governor Andrews sent 200 boxes to the Surgeon General. I received so many that at one time there were 20 ladies, several of them with ambulances, distributing those which came to my address, and if there was any more hospital gangrene that season, I neither saw nor heard of it. The officers in Campbell knew of the letter and were glad of the supplies it brought, but some time passed before they identified the writer as the little sister in the bad ward, who had won the reputation of being the best wound dresser in Washington. End of chapter 53. Chapter 54 of Half a Century by Jane Grey SWISSHELM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Get permission to work. Rules required me to leave Campbell at 5 o'clock, but the sun was going down, and I lay on a cot in the bad ward, feeling that going home or anywhere else was impossible, when that large doctor came, felt my pulse, laid his hand on my brow, and said, "You must not work so hard or we will lose you. I have been hunting for you to ask if you would like to remain with us." "Like to remain with you? Well, you will have to send a file of soldiers with fixed bayonets to drive me away." He laughed quite heartily and said, "We do not want you to go away. I am Executive Officer Surgeon Kelly, and Dr. Baxter, surgeon in charge, has commissioned me to say that if you wish to stay, he will have a room prepared for you. He hunted for you to say so in person, but is gone. Now I await your decision. Shall I order you a room?" "Surgeon Baxter? Why, what does he know about me?" "Oh, Surgeon Baxter, 2 medical inspectors and the surgeon of this ward were present this morning when you came in and took possession." His black eyes twinkled, and he shook with laughter when I sat up, clasped my hands, and said, "Oh, dear! Were they the men who were standing around Charlie? Why, I had not dreamed of their being surgeons." "Did you not know by their shoulder straps?" "Shoulder straps? Do surgeons have shoulder straps? I thought only officers wore them." "Well, surgeons are officers, and you can know by my shoulder straps that I am a surgeon." "Oh, I do not mind you. But Dr. Baxter, how I did behave before him! What must he have thought? And he does not allow women to come here." "Well, you passed inspection, and as you propose to stay with us, I will have a room prepared for you." He then went on to state that the reason Dr. Baxter would not have female nurses was that he would not submit to Miss Dix's interference, did not like the women she chose, and army regulations did not permit him to employ any other. "But," he continued, "no one can object to his entertaining a guest, and as his guest you can employ your time as you wish." Ah, what a glorious boon it was, this privilege of work, and my little barrack room, just twice the width of my iron cot, I would not have exchanged for any suite in Windsor Palace. End of chapter 54. Chapter 55 of Half a Century by Jane Grey SWISSHELM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Find a name. Nothing was more needed in the bad ward than an antidote for homesickness, and to furnish this I used my talking talent to the utmost, but no subject was so interesting as myself. I was the mystery of the hour. Charlie was commissioned to make discoveries, and the second day came with a long face and said, "Do you know what they say about you?" "No, indeed." "And suspect I should never guess." "Well, they say you're an old maid." I stopped work, rose from my knees, confronted him, and exclaimed with an injured air, "An old maid? Why, Charlie, is it possible you let them talk in that manner about me after the nice pickles I gave you?" The pickles had made him sick, and now there was a general laugh at his expense, but he stuck to his purpose and said, "Well, ain't you an old maid?" "An old maid, Charlie? Did any one ever see such a saucy boy? Oh, but tell us, good earnest, ain't you an old maid?" Well then, good earnest, Charlie, I expect I shall be one, if I live to be old enough. Live to be old enough? How old do you call yourself? I set down my basin, counted on my fingers, thought it over, and replied, well, if I live 2 months and 5 days longer, I shall be 16. Then there was a shout at Charlie's expense, and I resumed my work grave as an owl. That furnished amusement until it grew stale, when Charlie came to ask me my name, and I told him it was Mrs. Snooks. Mrs. Snooks? Repeated a dozen men, who looked sadly disappointed, and Charlie most of all, as I added, yes, Mrs. Timothy Snooks of Snooksville, Minnesota. This was worse and worse. It was evident no one liked the name, but all save one were too polite to say so, and he roared out, I don't believe a word of it. I sat at some distance with my back to him, dressing a wound, and without turning said, why, what is the matter with you? I don't believe that such a looking woman as you are ever married a fellow by the name of Snooks. That is because you are not acquainted with the Snooks family. Brother Peter's wife is a much better looking woman than I. Good looking, he sneered. Call yourself good looking, do you? Well, I think you intimated as much. Did he not, boys? They all said he had, and the laugh was turned on him, but he exclaimed doggedly, I don't care, I'm not going to call you Snooks. And what do you propose to call me? I'll call you Mary. But Mary is not my name. I don't care, it's the name of all the nice girls I know. Very good, I too shall probably be a nice girl if I live to grow up, but just now it seems as if I should die in infancy. I'm too good to live. You're the greatest torment ever any man saw. The last pin was in that bandage. I arose, turned, and the thought flashed through my brain, a tiger. His eyes literally blazed, and I went to him, looking straight into them, just as I had done into Tom's more than once. A mini rifle ball had passed through his right ankle, and when I saw him first, the flesh around the wound was purple and the entire limb swollen almost to bursting. The ward master told me he had been given up 3 days before and was only waiting his turn to be carried to the dead house. Next morning the surgeon confirmed the account, said he had been on the amputation table, and sent away and hoped the foot might be saved, adding, I think we were influenced by the splendor of the man's form. It seemed sacrilege to mangle such a leg then, before we knew it was too late. I thought the inflammation might be removed. He said if that were done, they could amputate and save him, and the conversation ended in the surgeon giving the man to me to experiment on my theory. This seemed to be generally known, and the case was watched with great interest. No one interfered with my treatment of him, and nurses designated him to me as your man. He was a cross between a Hercules and an Apollo. Gray-eyed, brown-haired, the finest specimen of physical manhood I had ever seen, and now his frail hold on life was endangered by the rage into which I had unwittingly thrown him. So I sat bathing and soothing him, looking ever and anon steadily into his eyes, and said, You had better call me Mother. Mother, he snarled, you my mother? Why not? Why, you're not old enough. I am twice as old as you are. No, you're not, and another thing, you're not big enough. He raised his head, surveyed me leisurely and contemptuously. His dark, silky mustache went up against his handsome nose as he sank back and said slowly, Why, you're not much bigger'n a bean. Still, I am large enough to take care of you and send you back to your regiment if you are reasonable, but no one can do anything for you if you fly into a rage in this way. Yes, and you know that, and you put me in a rage, going after them other fellows. You know I've got the best right to you. I claim you soon as you come in the door, and called you afore you got half down the ward. You said you'd take care of me, and now you don't do it. The surgeon give me to you too. You know I can't live if you don't save me, and you don't care if I die. I was penitent and conciliatory, and promised to be good, when he said doggedly, Yes, and I'll call you Mary. Very well, Mary is a good name. It was my mother's, and I shall no doubt come to like it. I guess it is a good name. It was my mother's name too, and any woman might be glad to be called Mary. But I never did see a woman that had any sense. He soon growled himself to sleep, and from that time I called him Ursa Major, but he only slept about half an hour, when a nurse in great fright summoned me. They had lifted him, and he had fainted. I helped to put him back into bed, and bathed him until consciousness returned, when he grasped my wrist with a vice-like hold and groaned, "Oh God, oh Mother, is this death?" I heard no more of Miss Mary or nice girls, but God and Mother and death were often on his lips. To the great surprise of everyone, I quelled the inflammation and fever, banished the swelling, and got him into good condition when the foot was amputated and shown to me. The ankle joint was ground into small pieces, and these were mingled with bits of leather and woolen sock. No wonder the inflammation had been frightful. But it was some time after that before I knew the foot might have been saved by making a sufficient opening from the outside, withdrawing the loose irritating matter, and keeping an opening through which nature could have disposed of her waste. I do not know if surgery have yet discovered this plain, common-sense rule, but tens of thousands of men have died, and tens of thousands of others have lost limbs because it was not known and acted upon. All those men who died of gunshot flesh wounds were victims to surgical stupidity. I nursed the cross man until he went about on crutches, and his faith in me was equal in perfection to his form, for he always held that I could stop this pain if I would, and rated me soundly if I was off in Ward 10 when he wanted me. One day he scolded worse than usual, and soon after an Irishman said in an aside, "Sure, mum, and you mustn't be after blamin' the rist of us for that fellow's impidence. Sure, and there's some of us that'd kick him out of the ward, if we could, for the way he talks to ye after all that ye have done for him, and for all of us." Why, how can you feel so? What difference is it to me how he talks? It does him good to scold, and what is the use of a man having a mother if he cannot scold her when he is in pain? I wish you would all scold me. It would do you ever so much good. You quite break my heart with your patience. Do please be as cross as bears, all of you, whenever you feel like it, and I will get you well in half the time. Sure, mum, and nobody ever saw the likes of ye. A man was brought from a field hospital and laid in our ward, and one evening his stump was giving him great pain, when the cross man advised him to send for me and exclaimed, "There's Mother now, send for her." "Oh," groaned the sufferer, "what can she do?" "I don't know what she can do, and she don't know what she can do, but just you send for her. She'll come, and go to fussin' and hummin' about you just like an old bumblebee, and first thing you know, you won't know nothin', for the pain'll be gone, and you'll be asleep." End of chapter 55. Chapter 56 of Half a Century by Jane Grey SWISSHELM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Drop My Alias. The second or third day of my hospital work, Mrs. Gaylord, the chaplain's wife, came and inquired to what order I belonged, saying that the officers of the hospital were anxious to know. I laughed and told her I belonged exclusively to myself and did not know of any order which would care to own me. Then she very politely inquired my name, and I told her it was Mrs. Jeremiah Snooks, when she went away, apparently doubting my statement. I had been in Campbell almost a week when Dr. Kelly came and said, "Madam, I have been commissioned by the officers of this hospital to ascertain your name. None of us know how to address you, and it is very awkward, either in speaking to you or of you, not to be able to name you." "Doctor, will not Mrs. Snooks do for a name for all the time I shall be here?" "No, madam, it will not do." I was very unwilling to give my name, which was prominently before the public, on account of my Indian lecture in the Tribune letters, but I seemed to have at least a month's work to do in Campbell. Hospital stores were pouring into my city address, and being sent to me at a rate which created much wonder, and the men who had given me their confidence had a right to know who I was. So I gave my name, and must repeat it before the doctor could realize the astonishing fact, even when he took off his cap and said, "It is not possible you are the Mrs. the lady who lectured in Dr. Sunderland's church?" So I was proclaimed with a great flourish of trumpets. For 2 hours my patients seemed afraid of me, and it did not seem too bad to merge that giantess of the bean-pole and the press, and the tall woman of the platform both, in poor little insignificant me. It was like blotting out the big bear and the middle-sized bear from the old bear story, and leaving only the one poor little bear to growl over his pot of porridge. In Ward 5 was one man who had been laid on his left side and never could be moved while he lived. His right arm suffered for lack of support, and when I knelt to give him nourishment with a spoon and pray with him that the deliverer would soon come, he always laid that arm over my shoulders. The first time I knelt there after I was known, he said, "Ah, you are such a great lady, and do not mind a poor soldier laying his arm over you." "Christ, the great captain of our salvation," I replied, "gathers you in his arms and pillows your head upon his bosom. Am I greater than he? Your good right arm has fought for liberty, and it is an honor to support it when you are no longer able." But nothing else I could ever say to him was so much comfort as the old cry of the sufferer by the wayside, "Jesus, thou Son of David, have mercy on me." Over and over again we said that prayer in concert, while he waited in agony for the only relief possible, that of death, and from our last interview I returned to the bad ward, so sad that I felt the shadow of my face fall upon every man in it. I could not drive away death's gloom, but I could work and talk, and both work and talk were needed. I sat down between two young Irishmen, both with wounded heads, and began to bathe them and comfort them, and said, "If you are not better in the morning, I shall amputate both those heads. They shall not plague you in this manner another day." Maybe my sad face made this funny, for their sense of the ridiculous was so touched that they clasped their sore heads and shrieked with laughter. Every man in the ward caught the infection, and I was called upon for explanations of the art of amputating heads, and inquiries as to Surgeon Baxter's capacity of performing the operation. This grotesque idea proved a fruitful subject of conversation, and aided in leading sufferers away from useless sorrow toward hope and health, and bad as the ward was, we lost but 2 men in it. End of chapter 56. Chapter 57 of Half a Century by Jane Grey SWISSHELM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Hospital Dress. In that sad ward, one superior, intelligent young man, who was thought to be doing well, suddenly burst an artery, and ropes were put up to warn visitors and others not to come in, and we who were in moved with bated breath lest some motion should start the life current. While his last hope was on a stillness which forbade him to move a finger, 2 lady visitors came to the door, were forbidden to enter, but seeing me inside must follow the sheep instinct of the sex and go where any other woman had gone. So with pert words they forced their entry in, made a general flutter, and oh horror, one of them caught her hoops on the iron cot of the dying man. He was only saved from a severe jerk by the prompt intervention of the special nurse. They were let out as quietly as possible, but the man had received a slight jerk and a serious shock. The hemorrhage would probably have returned if they had not come in, but it did return, and the young, strong life ebbed steadily away in a crimson current which spread over the floor. From that day until the end of my hospital work, one fact forced itself upon my attention, and this is that with all the patriotism of the American women during that war, and all their gush of sympathy for the soldier, a vast majority were much more willing to kiss him for his mother than render him any solid service, and that not 1 in 100 of the women who succeeded in getting into hospitals would dress so as not to be an object of terror to men whose life depended on quiet. Women were capable of any heroism save wearing a dress suitable for hospital work. The very, very few who laid aside their hoops, those instruments of dread and torture, generally donned bloomers and gave offense by airs of independence. Good women would come long distances to see dying husbands, brothers and sons, and fill the wards with alarm by their whoops. When anyone was hurt by them, they were very sorry, but never gave up the cause of offense, while their desire to look well, and the finery and fixings they donned to improve their appearance, was a very broad and painful burlesque. Women were seldom permitted to stay in a hospital overnight, even with a dying friend, and the inhabitants were generally glad when they started for home. It was the dress nuisance which caused nuns to have the preference in so many cases, but I could not see or hear that they ever did anything but make converts to the church and take care of clothing and jellies. One thing is certain, that is, that women never can do efficient and general service in hospitals until their dress is prescribed by laws inexorable as those of the Medes and Persians. Then that dress should be entirely destitute of steel, starch, whalebone, flounces, and ornaments of all descriptions, should rest on the shoulders, have a skirt from the waist to the ankle, and a waist which leaves room for breathing. I never could have done my hospital work but for the dress which led most people to mistake me for a nun. End of chapter 57. Chapter 58 of Half a Century by Jane Grey SWISSHELM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Special work. In the wilderness of work I must choose, and began to select men who had been given up by the surgeons, and whom I thought might be saved by special care. Surgeon Kelly soon entered into my plan, and made his ward my headquarters. To it my special patients were brought, until there was no more room for them. That intuitive perception of the natural position of muscles, and the importance of keeping them in it, which came to me on first seeing a wound dressed, gave me such control over pain that I used to go through the wards between midnight and morning, and put amputation cases to sleep at the rate of 1 in 15 minutes. In these morning walks I saw that the nurses were on duty, and had substantial refreshments, saw those changes for the worse sure to come, if they came at all in those chill hours. Seeing them soon was important to meeting them successfully, and I succeeded in breaking up many a chill before it did serious damage, which must have proved fatal if left until the morning visit of the surgeon. Also in those walks I chose special cases, have more than once sat down by a man and calculated in this way: you may have 20, 40 years of useful life, if I can save you. I shall certainly die 1 year sooner for the labor I expend on you, but there will be a large gain in the average of life and usefulness, and when you risk all of your life for the country, as much mine as yours, it is but just that I should give a small part of mine to save you. Every man lived whom I elected to life, and Dr. Kelly, who knew more than anyone else about my plans, and on whom I most counted for aid, has said that I saved enough to the government in bounty money by returning men to duty who would otherwise have died, to warrant it in supporting me the balance of my life. But his statements could not always be relied upon, for he insisted that I never slept, had not been asleep during the 7 weeks spent in Campbell, was a witch, and would float like a cork if thrown from the Long Bridge into the Potomac. In selecting a man in desperate case to be saved, I always took his temperament and previous life into consideration. A man of pure life and sanguine temperament was hard to kill. Give him the excuse of good nursing, and he would live through injuries which must be fatal to a bilious, suspicious man, or one who had been guilty of any excess. A tobacco chewer or smoker died on small provocation. A drunkard or debauchee was killed by a scratch. There were 2 ward surgeons who disapproved of the innovation of a woman in Campbell, and especially of one held amenable to no rules. They were both in favor of heroic treatment, which I did not care to witness, and I spent little time in their wards. One of them kept a man with 2 bricks tied to his foot and hanging over the foot of his bed, until he died, after 10 days of a sleepless agony, such as could not well have been excelled in an inquisition, while his wife tried to comfort him under a torture she begged in vain to have remitted. The night after she started home with his body, I was passing through the ward when I came upon a young Philadelphia Zouave in a perfect paroxysm of anguish. 3 nurses stood around him, and to my inquiry, "What is the matter?" replied by dumb show that coming death was the matter, and that soon all would be over, while in words they told me he had not slept for 48 hours. I had one place a chair for me and sat down, and with my long thin hands grasped the thigh stump which was making all the trouble, drew and pressed the muscle into a natural easy position, cooed and talked and comforted the sufferer as I should have done a sick baby, and in 10 minutes he was asleep. Then I whispered the nurses to bring cotton and oakum and little cushions, made them put the cotton and oakum in small tufts to my index fingers, and while I crooned my directions in a sing-song lullaby air, I worked in this support, gradually and imperceptibly withdrawing my hands until I could substitute the little cushions for the force by which they held the muscle in proper position. This done, my boy soldier slept as sweetly as ever he had done in his crib. Next morning a nurse came running for me to hurry to him. He had slept 6 hours, waked, had his breakfast, and had his wound dressed, and now the pain was back bad as ever. I went, fixed the mangled muscle with reference to his change of position, made a half mold to hold it there, and before I had finished he began an 8-hour sleep. 10 days after, he was sent home to his mother, and I saw or heard of him no more. End of chapter 58. Chapter 59 of Half a Century by Jane Grey SWISSHELM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Heroic and anti-heroic treatment. The other ward in which I was not welcome adjoined that one in which my room was situated, and to reach it I must go out of doors or pass through 1/2 the length of that ward. In these passages I had an opportunity for studying Pyaemia and its ordinary treatment, and could give the men lemonade when they wanted it. In this ward lay a young German with a wounded ankle. He had a broad square forehead, skin white as wax, large blue eyes, and yellow hair inclined to curl. His whole appearance indicated high culture and an organization peculiarly sensitive to pleasure or pain, but no one seemed to understand that he suffered more than others from a like cause. Surgeon and nurses scoffed at his moans, and thought it babyish for a muscular man over 6 feet to show so many signs of pain. I think that from some cause the surgeon felt vindictive toward him, and that his subordinates took their cue from him. When I went to give him lemonade, he would clutch my hand or dress, look up in my face, and plead, "Oh, Mutter, Mutter." But if I sat down to soothe and comfort him, a nurse always came to remind me of the surgeon's orders, and I used to go around on the outside that he might not see and call me. When he was in the amputation room, I heard his shrieks and groans, and carried a glass of wine to the door for him. He heard my voice and called, "Mutter, Mutter." I pushed past the orderly, ran to him, and his pleading eyes seemed to devour me as he fastened his gaze on my face. I cannot think to this day why he should have been nude for the amputation of a foot, but he was, and someone threw a towel across his loins as I approached. Dr. Baxter said, "No sympathy, no sympathy." So I stood by him, placed a hand on each side of his corrugated brow, steadied my voice, and said, "Be a man and a soldier." He had asked me for bread. I gave him a stone, and no wonder he dashed it back in my face with a fierce cry, "I have been a man and a soldier long enough." Ah, verily had he, and much too long. Days before that he should have been a boy again, I a baby, a very infant, should have been soothed and softened and comforted with all the tenderness of mother love. But even now, in this cruel extremity, every sign of sympathy was denied him. Someone put a hand gently but firmly on each of my shoulders, turned my back to him, took me out of the room, and I hurried away, while the air shuddered with his shrieks and groans. After he had been brought back to his place in the ward, I could often hear him as I passed to and from my room, and even while I occupied it. Once he saw me through the open door and called, "Mutter, Mutter." I went, knelt by him, took his hands, which were stretched appealingly to me, and spoke comforting words, while his blue eyes seemed ready to start from their sockets as he clung to my hands with the old familiar cry, "Oh, Mutter, Mutter." He was strapped down to his iron cot about as closely as he had been to the amputation table, and the cot fastened to the floor. I had not been 5 minutes at his side when his special nurse hurried up and warned me to leave, saying, "It's surgeon's orders. He's not going to have any babying." I drew my hands from the frantic grasp, took away that last hold on human sympathy, and hurried out, while his cry of "Oh, Mutter, Mutter," rung in my ears as I turned and looked on his pure high brow for the last time. Next morning I heard he had lockjaw and that the surgeon was to leave. The night after that victim of some frightful fiendish experiment had been carried to the dead house, I was passing through the ward when attracted by the sounds of convulsive weeping, and I found a young man in an agony of grief, in one of those sobbing fits sure to come to the bravest. He was in a high fever, and while I bathed his face and hands, I asked the cause of his outbreak, and he sobbed, "Oh, the pain in my wound! This is the 3rd night I have not slept, and by God I can bear it no longer." It was a flesh wound in the thigh, such an one as usually proved fatal, and while I set him to talking, I began patching scraps of observation into a theory. He was from Pennsylvania, and bitterly charged his State with having done nothing for her wounded, and when I asked why he had not sent for me, he said, "Oh, I thought you were from Massachusetts, like all the rest of them, and if my State would do nothing for me, I would not beg. People come here every day looking for Massachusetts soldiers. Since I have been frantic here, ladies have come and stood and looked at me and said, 'Poor fellow,' as if I had been a dog. I was as well raised as any of them, even if I am a common soldier." I thought his recovery very doubtful, and talked to draw his thoughts to the better land. To his charges against his native land, I said, "I am a Pennsylvanian, and more than that, the governor of Pennsylvania sent me to you, bade me come tonight, that you might know he had not forgotten you." "He did?" "Why, how did he know anything about it?" "He just knows all about it, and has been caring for you all this time. I do not mean Andy Curtin, he's nothing but a subaltern, but the dear Lord, our Father in heaven, who never forgets us, though he often afflicts us. He sent me to you now, that you might know he loves you. It was he who made me love you and care to help you. All the love and care that come to you are a part of his love." He wept afresh, but less bitterly, and said, "Oh, you will think I am a baby. Well, that is just what you ought to be. Your past life is sufficient certificate of manhood, and now has come your time to be a baby, while I am your mother. You have been lying here like an engine under a high pressure of steam, and the safety valve fastened down with a billet of wood, until there had been almost an explosion. Now just take away that stick of wood, your manhood and pride, and let out all the groans and tears you have pent in your heart. Cry all you can. This is your time for crying." When I had talked him into a mood to let me feel if his feet were warm, I found that wounded limb dreadfully swollen, cold almost as death, stretched out as he lay on his back, and a cushion right under the heel. Had there been no wound, the position must have been unendurable. Without letting him know, I drew that cushion up until it filled the hollow between the heel and calf of the leg, and supported the strained muscle, tucked a handful of oakum under the knee, moved the toes, brushed and rubbed the foot until circulation started, sponged it, rolled it in flannel, of which I had a supply in my basket, washed the well foot and put a warm woolen sock on it, arranged the cover so that it would not rest on the toes of the sore leg, told him to get the new surgeon next morning to make a large opening on the lower side of his thigh where the bullet had gone out, to ask him to cut lengthwise of the muscle, get out everything he could that ought not to be in there, keep that opening open with a roll of bandage, so that old Mother Nature should have a trapdoor through which she could throw her chips out of that workshop in his thigh, to be sure and not hint to the surgeon that I had said anything about it, and not fail to have it done. I left him asleep, and the next day he told me the surgeon had taken a quart of pus and several pieces of woolen cloth out of his wound, and his recovery was rapid. End of chapter 59. Chapter 60 of Half a Century by Jane Grey SWISSHELM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Cost of order. In making molds and rests for mangled limbs, I had large demands for little cushions, and without economy could not get enough. When one just fitted in place, I wanted to keep it, and to do this must have it aired, perhaps washed. To avoid lint dressings, I hunted pieces of soft table linen, gave to patients pieces to suit, and as the supply was short, they would get nurses and surgeons to leave their pieces of linen, after dressing their wounds, until I could take charge and have them cleansed for the next time. To do all this, I must use the grass plats and railings for airing and drying cushions and rags. These plats and railings were for ornament, and there was soon a protest against putting them to such vile uses. I had gone into the hospital with the stupid notion that its primary object was the care and comfort of the sick and wounded. It was long after that I learned that a vast majority of all benevolent institutions are gotten up to gratify the aesthetic tastes of the public, exhibit the wealth and generosity of the founders, and furnish places for officers. The beneficiaries of the institutions are simply an apology for their existence, and having furnished that apology, the less said about them, the better. The surgeons at Campbell did really want its patients to be happy and to get well, but it was a model institution with a reputation to sustain, was part of a system under general laws which might not be broken with impunity. There was no law against a man dying for want of sleep from pain caused by misplaced muscle, but the statutes against litter were inexorable as those of the Medes and Persians. The Campbell surgeons winked at my litter until one regular inspection day, when my cushions and rags, clean and unclean, those marked John Smith and those labeled Tom Brown, were all huddled up and stuffed en masse into the pantry closet. I used to wonder if the Creator had invented a new variety of idiot and made a lot in order to supply the army with medical inspectors, or if by some cunning military device the Surgeon General had been able to select all those conglomerations of official dignity and asinine stupidity from the open donkey market of the world. Inspecting a hospital was just like investigating an Indian fraud. The man whose work was to be inspected or investigated met the inspector or investigator at the door, showed him all he wished him to see, and examined witnesses wholly in his power. When the inspected and inspector, the investigated and investigator exchanged compliments, and the public were gratified to learn that all was in a most gratifying condition of perfect order. One day we had a particularly searching inspection, and next day nurse told me of some 4 new cases which had been brought in a week before, one of whom the inspector said was past hope. I found his feet and legs with a crust on them like the shell of a snail, had a piece of rubber cloth laid under them, and with tepid water, a good crash towel, and plenty of rubbing, got down to the skin, which I rubbed well with lard. Then, with fresh towels and water at hand, I drew away the sheet in which the patient had rolled his head, and while I washed his head and arms and breast, I talked, and he tried to answer, but it was some time before he could steady his tongue and lips so as to articulate, and when he did, his first words were, "Are you the woman that's been a-washing my feet?" "That is exactly what I have been doing, and much need they had of it." "Do you not think you are a pretty fellow to have come all the way from Minnesota to wash your feet?" It was with much effort he could fix his dazed eyes on my face, and he made several pitiful attempts before he succeeded in saying, "I think you're the best woman that ever I saw." Ah, that is because you never saw much away out there in Venango County, Pennsylvania, where you live. There are thousands of better women than I running around hunting work in this part of the country." "Is there?" "Yes, indeed, and nothing for them to do." "I never saw none of 'em." "That is because you have had your head rolled up in that sheet. Just keep your head uncovered so you can breathe this nice fresh air. Open your eyes every little while, and you will see a whole row of those women, all hunting work." He seemed quite interested, and when I had done washing and given instructions to a nurse to cleanse the balance of his person, I asked if there was anything more I could do for him, when he stammered, "Not unless you could get me a cup of tea, a cup of good green tea, without any milk or sugar in it. If you do, I'll pay you for it." "Pay me for it, will you? How much will you give me, 3 cents? "Oh, I'll give you 25 cents. 25 cents for a cup of good green tea without any milk or sugar in it. I called the ward to witness the bargain, said that I should grow rich at that rate, and hurried off for the tea. I had a little silver tray and tea set with 2 china cups. Mrs. Gangwer of the Ohio Aid Society had sent me a tin tea kettle and spirit lamp. Folks at a distance had sent plenty of the best tea, and that little tea tray had become a prominent feature of Campbell long before this poor fellow specified his want. I made the tray unusually attractive that day and fed him his tea from a spoon, while he admired the tiny pot, out of which with the aid of the kettle I could furnish 20 cups of good tea. When I had served all in that ward who wanted tea, the first one took a second cup, and while taking it his skin grew moist, and I knew he was saved from that death of misplaced matter vulgarly called dirt, to which well-paid medical inspectors had consigned him, while giving their invaluable scientific attention to floor scrubbing and bed making, to whitewashing and laundry work. I doubt if there were a medical inspector in the army who was not a first-rate judge of the art of folding and ironing a sheet or pillow slip, of the particular tuck which brought out the outlines of the corners of a mattress as seen through a counterpane, and of the art and mystery of cleaning a floor. It did seem as if they had all reached office through their great proficiency as cabin boys. Next day I went to that ward with my tea tray, and after learning that that man had been washed once more, asked him if he wanted another cup of tea. "I'd like to have one," he stammered, "but I didn't pay you for the last one, and I can't find my wallet." I saw the debt troubled him, and took this as one more evidence that somewhere there were people who sold hospital stores to sick soldiers. So I took pains to explain that he owed me nothing, that the tea was his, ladies had sent it to me to give to him, and all the pay they wanted was for him to get well and go home to his mother. The idea that someone was thinking for him seemed to do him almost as much good as the tea. I left Campbell next day, but on my first visit found him convalescing, and on the second visit he ran down the ward, holding his sides and laughing, and I saw or heard of him no more. End of chapter 60. Chapter 61 of Half a Century by Jane Grey SWISSHELM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Learn to control Pyaemia. About 10 days after I went to Campbell, I was called at midnight to a deathbed. It was a case of flesh wound to the thigh, and the whole limb was swollen almost to bursting, so cold as to startle by the touch, and almost as transparent as glass. I knew this was Pyaemia, and that for it medical science had no cure, but I wanted to warm that cold limb, to call circulation back to that inert mass. The first thought was warm, wet compresses, hot bricks, hot flannel, but the kitchen was locked, and it was little I could do without fire, except to receive and write down his dying messages to parents and the girl who was waiting to be his wife. When the surgeon's morning hour came, he still lived, and at my suggestion the warm compresses were applied. He said, "They feel so good," and was quite comforted by them, but died about 10 o'clock. I was greatly grieved to think he had suffered from cold the last night of life, but how avoid any number of similar occurrences? There was no artificial heat in any of the wards. A basin of warm water was only to be obtained by special favor of the cooks, but they had been very courteous. The third day of my appearance among them, one looked up over the edge of the tub, over which he bent, washing potatoes, and said, as I stood waiting for hot water, "Do you know what you look like, going around here among us fellows?" "No, but nothing dreadful, I hope." "You just look like an angel, and that's what we all think. We're ever so much better since you came." The memory of this speech gave me courage to go and lay my trouble before the cooks, who gathered to hear me tell the story of that death, the messages left for the friends who should see him no more, and of my sorrow that I could not drive away the cold on that last sad night. They all wiped their eyes on their aprons. Head cook went to a cupboard, brought a key, and handed it to me, saying, "There, mother, is a key of this kitchen. Come in here whenever you please. We will always find room on the ranges for your bricks, and I'll have something nice in the cupboard every night for you and the nurses." This proved to be the key to the situation, and after I received that bit of metal from cook, there was not one death from Pyaemia in any ward where I was free to work, although I have had as many, I think, as 60 men struck with the premonitory chill in one night. I concluded that Pyaemia was French for neglect, and that the antidote was warmth, nourishing food, stimulants, friction, fresh air, and cheerfulness, and did not hesitate to say that if death wanted to get a man out of my hands, he must send some other agent than Pyaemia. I do not believe in the medical theory concerning it, do not believe pus ever gets into the veins, or that there is any poison about it, except that of ignorance and indifference on the part of doctors and nurses. End of chapter 61. Chapter 62 of Half a Century by Jane Grey SWISSHELM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. First case of growing a new bone. I had searched for Minnesota men in Campbell, found none, and had been there a week when Mrs. Kelsey told me there was one in Ward 10 credited to a Wisconsin regiment, and from him I learned that he was a friend and neighbor of my friends Mr. and Mrs. Bancroft of Mantorville, and my conscience reproached me for not sooner finding him. But the second day Mrs. Gaylord came as a messenger from the surgeons to tell me I need not spend time and strength on him, as he could not be saved. His was a thigh wound. They had thought to amputate, but found the bone shattered from joint to joint, had with a chainsaw cut it off above the knee, and picked out the bone in pieces. There was a splinter attached to the upper joint, but that was all the bone left in the thigh, and the injury was one from which recovery was impossible. His father, a doctor, was visiting him, and knew he must die. I went to the patient, who said, "Dr. True, the ward surgeon, has just been here and tells me I must die." I sat by him, fitting the measure I had been taking for 2 days to this new aspect of the case, and talking of death and the preparation for it, until I thought I understood the case, when I said, "Be ready for death, as every one of any sense should always be, but I do not intend to let you die." "I guess you cannot help it. All the surgeons and father agree that there is no hope for me." "But they are all liable to be mistaken, and none of them have taken into the account your courage and recuperative force, your good life and good conscience, your muscle like a pine log, your pure breath, your clear skin and good blood. I do not care what they say. You will live. I will not let you die." I found Dr. Baxter and said, "I want you to save Corporal Kendall." "Corporal Kendall? Who's he?" "The man out of whose thigh you took the bone last week." His face grew sad, but he said, "Well, we mean to save them all if we can." "Doctor, that is no answer. I am interested in this man, know his friends, and want to understand his case. If I can keep his stomach in good working order, and well supplied with blood-making food, keep away chills and keep down pain so that he can sleep, will he not get well?" He laughed and replied, "Well, I never really heard of a man dying under such circumstances. "I can do that, doctor." "If you can, you will save him, of course, and we will give him to you." "But, doctor, you must do all the surgery. I must not give him pain, cannot see that wound." "Oh, certainly we will do everything in our power, but he is yours, for we have no hope of saving him." "Another thing, doctor, you will have him brought to Ward 4. He gave the order at once, adding, "Put him to the right of Howard," a young Philadelphian with a thigh stump who was likely to die of hemorrhage, and whose jerking nerves I could soothe and quiet better than anyone else. By this arrangement, the man, minus a thigh bone, was placed in the center of my field of labor and under the care of Dr. Kelly, but full 10 days after this arrangement was made, he came with a rueful face and said, "We have consulted the Surgeon General, Medical Inspector, and a dozen other surgeons outside the hospital, and they all agree that there is no hope for Kendall. The surgeons here have commissioned me to tell you, for we think you ought to know. We all appreciate what you are doing and think you will save all your other men if you live, but you cannot stand this strain long. You do not know it, but there is a limit to your powers of endurance, and you are breaking. You certainly will die if you keep on as you have been going, and it is not worth your while to kill yourself for Kendall, for you cannot save him." "And what is the reason he cannot be saved?" "Well, there are several reasons. First, I performed the operation and did not do it as thoroughly as I wished. He was coming out from under the influence of the chloroform, and they hurried me. The case was hopeless and no use to give him pain, so there are several pieces of bone which I failed to find. These are driven into the flesh, and nature, in trying to get rid of them, will get up such excessive suppuration that he must die of exhaustion. Then there is the thigh without a bone, and there's nothing in the books to warrant a hope that it can heal in that condition. We could not in any case hope for the formation of new bone. There are resections of 2 inches, but this is the longest new formation of which we know anything, and in this case there can be no hope because the periosteum is destroyed." "Periosteum, doctor? What is that again?" "It is the bone feeder, the strong membrane which encloses the bone, and through which it is made. In this case it is absolutely destroyed, removed, torn to shreds, gone, so there are several reasons why he cannot be saved." "Dr. Kelly, do you intend to let him lie there and die?" Oh, no, I will do all in my power for him. I am paid for that. It is my duty. But it is not your duty to sacrifice your life in a vain effort to save another." "Dr. Kelly, he shall not die. I will not let him. I know nothing about your books and bones, but he can live with 1 bone wanting, and I tell you he shall not die, and I will not die either." It was a week or more after this conversation I found my patient one morning with blue lips and a pinched nose, and said to him, "What is this?" "Well, I had a chill last night." "A chill, and did not send for me?" "You were here until after midnight and must have some rest." "Corporal Kendall, how dare you talk to me in that manner? You promised to send for me if there were any change for the worse, and after this I cannot trust you. Now I must stay here. Do you think I am going to lose my investment in you? Do you suppose I would work over you as I have been doing and then drop you for fear of a little more work?" As I passed to the kitchen, I found that blue lips and pinched noses had suddenly come into fashion, that there were more of them than I had time to count, but did not, for a moment, dream of letting a man get into the graveyard by that gate. The merry young Irishman who had volunteered as my orderly had a period of active service, and no more willing pair of hands and feet ever were interposed between men and death. Hot bricks, hot blankets, bottles of hot water, hot whiskey punch, and green tea were the order of the forenoon, and of a good many hours of night and day after it, for that victory was won by a long struggle. For 10 nights I never lay down in my room, but slept all I did sleep, lying on a cot about the center of Ward 4, and 2 cots from the man minus a bone. I could drop asleep in an instant, and sleep during ordinary movements, but a change in a voice brought me to my post in a moment. I could command anything in the dispensary or storerooms at any hour of the day or night, and carried many a man through the crisis of a night attack, when if he had been left until discovered in the morning there would have been little hope for him, and when a surgeon could have done nothing without a key to the kitchen which none of them had. I kept no secrets from any of them, told each one just what I had done in his ward, thankfully received his approval and directions, asked about things I did not understand, and was careful that my nursing was in harmony with his surgery. During that trial time, there was one night that death seemed to be gaining the victory in Corporal Kendall's case. Pain defied my utmost efforts and held the citadel. Sleep fled. The circulation grew sluggish, and both he and I knew that the result hung on the hour. It was 2:00 a.m., and from midnight I had been trying to bring rest. The injured limb was suspended in a zinc trough. I had raised, lowered it by imperceptible motions, cut bandage where it seemed to bind, tucked in bits of cotton or oakum, kept the toes in motion, irritated the surface wherever I could get the point of a finger in through the bandages, kept up the heat of the body and the hope of the soul, and sat down to hold his hands and try mesmeric passes and sounds, when he turned his head on the pillow and said, "Even if I should get well, I'll never be fit for infantry service again." "No, you never will." "I might walk with that machine you talk of, but never could march and carry a knapsack. But I have been thinking. I'm a pretty good engineer. You know Secretary Stanton? You might get me transferred to the Navy, and I could run an engine on a gunboat." "That is it exactly. You will get over this. I will have you transferred to a gunboat, and next time you will go into the rebellion prow foremost. You ought to be at work in time to help take Charleston." I continued to talk in a sing-song croon, to stroke his head and hold his hand until he slept, which was but a few moments after settling that transfer, and the last time I saw him, which was in '79, he got over the ground and up and down stairs as fast as most people, his new bone being quite as good as any of the old ones, except being a little short and decidedly crooked, although the crook did not affect its usefulness or general appearance. End of chapter 62. Chapter 63 of Half a Century by Jane Grey SWISSHELM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. A Heroic Mother. James Bride, who drew me to Campbell by asking for something to quench thirst, was one of the thousands who died of flesh wounds for want of surgical trap-doors through which nature might throw out her chips. His wound was in the hip, and no opening ever was made to the center of the injury, except that made by the bullet which had gone in and stayed there. His mother came 3 days before he died, and being minus hoops and finery, the ward surgeon was anxious she should remain with her son, and we arranged that she should sleep in my room. There was just space between the cot and wall for the breadth of a mattress, and when the door was shut, that space was long enough for me to lie between the door and the stand. I have never entertained a guest more cheerfully, or one by whose presence I felt more honored. Yet the traveling costume was a short calico dress, strong leather shoes, and blue woolen stockings, visible below the dress, a gingham sunbonnet, and double-bordered cap tied under her chin. Several richly dressed ladies came from Eastern cities to see dying relatives, but to none of them were the surgeons so thoroughly respectful as to this plain, strong, clean, high-souled countrywoman who stayed with her son and was hailed with joy by all the men in his ward, to every one of whom she was sympathetic and helpful. Her case was hard. She and her husband, who was old and feeble, had just 3 sons, 2 strong and vigorous, 1 a cripple. Their 2 vigorous sons enlisted together and fell in the charge on Marie's Hill within 10 feet and 10 minutes of each other. William was buried on the battlefield, and she had come to see James die in hospital. When all was over and her boy was carried to the dead house, they brought her to me, and I have never heard such pathetic, eloquent expressions of grief as those she poured forth in that little rough barracks room. "Oh, William, William," she sobbed, You are lying tonight in your bloody grave, and your mother will never know where it is. And you, James, you were my firstborn, but I cannot go to you now, where you lie in the darkness among the dead. Oh, but it is a sad story I must carry to your old father, to bring his gray hairs and sorrow to the grave. Who can we lean upon in our old age? Who will take care of Johnny when we are gone? Oh, it is a hard, hard lot." She wrung her hands, bowed over her knees in a paroxysm of tears, then raised herself, threw back her head, and exclaimed, "But, oh, boys dear, wouldn't I rather you were where you are this night, than that you had thrown down your guns and run." End of chapter 63. Chapter 64 of Half a Century by Jane Grey SWISSHELM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Two kinds of appreciation. Looking down the long vista of memory to the many faces turned to me from beds of pain, I find few to which I can attach a name, and one I seem never to have looked upon but once. It is a long, sallow face, surmounted by bushy yellow hair. It has a clear oval outline and straight nose, brown eyes, and a down of young manhood on the wasted, trembling lips. I knew it then as the face of a fever patient, but not one to whom I had rendered any special service, and felt surprised when the trembling lips said in a pitiful, pleading way, "We boys has been a-talking about you." "Have you, my dear? And what have you boys been saying about me?" "We've just been a-saying that good many ladies has been kind to us, but none of 'em ever loved us but you." "Well, my dear, I do not know how it is with the other ladies, but I am sure I do love you very, very dearly. You do not know half how much I love you." "Oh, yes, we do. Yes, we do. We know it you don't take care of us 'cause it's your duty. You just do it 'cause you love to." "That is it exactly. Just because I love to and because I want you to get well and go to your mother's." "Yes, but the boys says you don't care about 'em when they get well." "They do not need to have me care for them when they are well." "Oh, yes, they do. Yes, they do, and if that's the way you're going to serve me, I'll stay sick a long time." When the hospital stores came to me so fast that there was great trouble in getting them wisely distributed, Campbell lent me an ambulance to go around and see where they were needed and supply as many as I could. I had a letter from an old Pittsburgh neighbor asking me to see his brother in Douglas Hospital, and went in an ambulance well supplied with jellies and fruit. Douglas Hospital was an institution of which the city was proud. It had much finer buildings than any other in the city, occupied the finest residence block in the city, and had a wide reputation for grandeur and beauty and superb management. I found the halls and rooms quite as elegant as I had any reason to expect, but was surprised to find that elegance undisturbed by the presence of sick or wounded men. In one back room a wounded officer looked lonely, and they said there were other rooms used for sick soldiers, but all I saw were parlors, reception rooms, offices, and sleeping apartments for surgeons and the Lady Abbess with her attendant Sisters of Mercy or Charity. After we had strolled through several sumptuous apartments, we were taken out into the adjoining square, where there were large barracks as white as lime, and brushes could make them, and making a pretty picture among the trees. Inside, the walls were white as on the outside, and the pictures already up, as well as those just being put up, were bright as bright could be. Indeed, I do not know how pictures could have been greener or bluer or yellower or redder, and when the show-off man called my attention to them, as calculated to make the place cheerful, I recognized their merit, but suggested that some paper blinds might be desirable to keep the sun from shining into the faces of the men who lay on the cots. The roof or walls did not seem well calculated to keep out wind or rain, but paper blinds would ward off sunshine. From the condition of the floor, it was evident that the demon of the scrubbing brush, which had possession of all model institutions, had full sway in Douglas Barracks. Pine boards could not well have been made whiter. No laundryman need have feared to own to the doing up of the bed linen and counterpanes, and science had not discovered any mode of making a bed look more like a packing box than those in that model hospital. What an impertinence a sick or wounded man was in one of those nice square beds. He was almost certain to muss and toss it, and this must have been a crowning calamity. After the showman had shown all he cared to have me see, I sat talking with the man I had come to visit, and he said in a whisper, "Are there lice in all the hospitals?" "Lice? Why, certainly not." "Well, there are plenty of them here, and they tell us they cannot be helped, that they have them in all the hospitals. Look here." He turned down the nice counterpane, and there in the blanket the disgusting creatures swarmed. I was shocked and half rose, in the impulse to make an outcry, but he warned me not to let anyone know he had told me, or it would be bad for him. I asked why he did not tell the surgeon. "He knows all about them and says they cannot be helped." "You have Sisters of Charity here, tell them." "Oh, they never do anything in the ward but walk around and talk nice and pray with men who are going to die. They must know about them." I walked around alone, and the showman did not seem to like it, but I talked with the men in the cots, put my hand under the cover, found feet encrusted with the exudations of fever until they were hard and dry as a bit of kindling wood, hair full of dust from the battlefield, and not one man had been washed since being carried away from it, while there were vermin in every bed. The ward master objected to my leaving a jar of jelly with my friend. It would spoil the good order of the ward, and all delicacies were to be given into the care of the Sisters. I found one of them who was quite willing to take charge of anything I wished to leave, but was powerless in the matter of vermin. It was the ward master's business to attend to that. It was the business of the Sisters to look after the clothing when it came from the laundry, put it in order, and give it out when wanted. My failure to get a bed for the man in the fort by applying to those in authority made me feel that it would be useless to try that plan about the vermin, and in my perplexity I turned to my old friend and confidant, the public. To reach it, I wrote to the New York Tribune, giving a very mild statement of the case. 2 days after, Surgeon Baxter came with a copy of that letter and told me he had been ordered to discharge me on account of it. I spoke of the men who must die if I left, and he was sorry but had no option. Then he bethought him that maybe I might get the Surgeon General to permit me to remain, at least until the cases of my special patients were settled, otherwise I must leave the hospital that day. He was sorry I had dated the letter from Campbell. Had it not been for this, he could use his influence to sustain me, but professional etiquette forbade him to harbor or countenance one who spoke unfavorably of a brother surgeon. In other words, by living in a hospital, I became one of a ring, bound to keep hospital secrets and use only words of commendation in speaking or writing of anything I saw. I took a streetcar and proceeded to the office of the Surgeon General, saw the man who held the lives of my patients in his hands, ate the only piece of humble pie that ever crossed my lips, by apologizing for telling the truth, and got permission to go back to the men who looked to me for life. I have felt that I made a great mistake, felt that if I had then and there made war to the knife, and the knife to the hilt, against the whole system of fraud and cruelty embodied in the hospital service, I should have saved many more lives in the end. Even while I talked to the head of that nest of corruption and listened to his inane platitudes about my duty as an inmate of a hospital to report abuses to him, and the regular way of proceeding, I did want to hurl the gauntlet of an irregular defiance into this plausible face, but the pleading eyes in Campbell held me. I could not let those men die, and die they must if I must leave them. Nobody denied the truth of my statements about Douglas Hospital, and I never learned that anyone objected to the facts or their continuance. It was only their exposure which gave offense. This letter made me an object of dread. Folks never knew what I might see or say next, and there soon rose another trouble about my living in Campbell, for Miss Dix objected, claimed that it was an infringement on her authority. Then again, there were others who could not see why there should be but one female nurse in Campbell. Dr. Baxter, by admitting me, had abandoned his ground, acknowledged that men alone could not manage a first-class hospital, and having discovered his mistake, was bound to rectify it by admitting a corps of lady nurses. He was bombarded by Miss Dix's official power, pestered by the persistent appeals of volunteers, sneered and scoffed at, and worried until he fell back on his old position and promptly dismissed me so soon as my patients were out of danger. He was always courteous to me as a visitor, and has my lasting gratitude and respect for breaking his rules and bearing the persecution he did, that I might do the work I did and could not have done without his effective and generous cooperation. The proportion of thigh stumps saved was the test of a hospital's success, and the summer I was in Campbell we saved 19 out of 20. Next summer, Chaplain Gaylord told me they lost 19 in 20 and added, "Pyaemia has literally swept our wards." End of chapter 64. Chapter 65 of Half a Century by Jane Grey SWISSHELM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Life and Death. When released from the hospital, I had neither money nor clothes, and this is all the account I can render to the generous people who sent me hospital stores. I could not answer their letters. Some of them I never read. I could only give up my life to distributing their bounty, and knew that neither their money nor my own had remained in my hands when it was necessary for me to borrow $2 to get a dress. My cloth traveling suit was no longer fit for use, and my platform suit too good. These were all I had brought to Washington, but the best men never refused me audience because I wore a Shaker bonnet, a black lawn skirt, and gray linen sack. Some thought I dressed in that way to be odd, but it was all I could afford. The Quartermaster General had canceled my appointment because I had not reported for duty, but Secretary Stanton reinstated me, and I went to work on the largest salary I had ever received, $50 a month. After some time it was raised to $60, and I was more than independent, but my health was so broken that half a dozen doctors commanded me to lie on my back for a month, and I spent every moment I could in that position. I had grown hysterical, and twice while at work in the office broke out into passionate weeping while thinking of something in my hospital experience, something I had borne when it occurred, without a tear or even without feeling a desire to weep. In September I had 20 days' absence to go to St. Cloud, settle my business, and bring my household goods. There were still no railroads in Minnesota, and I was 6 days going, must have 6 to return, and 1 to visit friends at Pittsburgh. Yet in the time left, sold the Democrat, closed my home, and met General Lowry for the first and last time. He called, and we spent an hour talking principally of the war, which he thought would result in 2 separate governments. His reason seemed to be entirely restored, but his prestige, power, wealth, and health were gone. I tried to avoid all personal matters as well as reference to our quarrel, but he broke into the conversation to say, "I am the only person who ever understood you. People now think you go into hospitals from a sense of duty, from benevolence, like those good people who expect to get to heaven by doing disagreeable things on earth. But I know you go because you must, go for your own pleasure. You do not care for heaven or anything else but yourself." He stopped, looked down, traced the pattern of the carpet with the point of his cane, then raised his head and continued, "You take care of the sick and wounded, go into all those dreadful places, just as I used to drink brandy, for the sake of the exhilaration it brings you." We shook hands on parting, and from our inmost hearts, I am sure, wished each other well. I was more than ever impressed by the genuine greatness of the man who had been degraded by the use of irresponsible power. We reached Washington in good time, and I soon realized the great advantage of rest. 6 hours of office work came so near nothing to do that had I been in usual health I should probably have raised some disturbance from sheer idleness. but I learned by and by that the close attention demanded to avoid mistakes could not well have been continued longer. Several ladies continued distributing hospital stores for me all that fall and winter, and next spring I still had some to send out. When I was able, I went myself, and in Carver found a man who had been wounded in a cavalry charge, said to have been as desperate as that of the Light Brigade, and who refused to take anything from me because he had seen enough of these people who go around hospitals pretending to take care of wounded soldiers. I convinced him it was his duty to take the jelly in order to prevent my stealing it. Also that it was for my interest to save his life, that I might not have to pay my share of the cost of burying him and getting a man in his place. Nay, that it was my duty to get him back into the saddle as fast as possible, that my government need not pay him for lying abed. He liked this view of the case, and not only took what I offered him, but next time I went, asked for Jefferson tie shoes to support his foot, and when I brought them said he would be ready for duty in a week. In Judiciary Square, a surgeon asked me to give a jar of currant jelly to a man in Ward 6 who was fatally wounded. I found the man, those in the neighboring cots and the nurse all very sad, talked to him a few minutes and said, "You think you are going to die. That is what they all say I must do." "Well, I say you are not going to do anything of the kind." "Oh, I guess I am." "Not unless you have made up your mind to it, and are quite determined. Those hip wounds kill a great many men because folks do not know how to manage them, and because the men are easy to kill. But it takes a good deal to kill a young man with a good conscience, who has never drank liquor or used tobacco, who has muscle like yours, a red beard and blue-gray eyes." I summoned both his day and night nurse, told all three together of the surgical trap door that old Mother Nature wanted made and kept open, clear up to the center of the wound. The surgeon would always make one if the patient wanted it. I told them about the warmth and nourishment and care needed, and left him and them full of hope and resolution. Next time I was in Judiciary, a young man on crutches accosted me, saying, "Were you not in Ward 6 about 6 weeks ago?" "Yes." "Do you remember a man there that everyone said was going to die, and you said he wouldn't?" "Yes." "Well, I'm the fellow." I looked at him inquiringly and said, "Well, did you die?" He burst into uproarious laughter and replied, "No, but I'm blamed if I wouldn't if you hadn't come along." I passed on, left him leaning against the wall, finishing his laugh, and saw or heard of him no more. It was but a few days after he passed out of my knowledge that news came of the death of General Lowry. It was the old story, the great man down, for he died in poverty and neglect, but with his better self in the ascendant. His body lies in an unmarked grave in that land where once his word was law. Pondering on his death, I thought of that country boy going to his father's house, with the life restored by one he knew not, even by name, in the going home of that mature man who thought he knew my inmost soul, and with whose political death I was charged. Only the wisdom of eternity can determine which, if either, I served or injured. To the one, life may lack blessing; to the other, death be all gain. End of chapter 65. Chapter 66 of Half a Century by Jane Grey SWISSHELM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Meet Miss Dix and go to Fredericksburg. I sat downstairs for the first time after a 2 weeks' illness, when Georgie Willits of Jersey City came in saying, "Here is a pass for you and one for me to go to Fredericksburg. A boat leaves in 2 hours and we must hurry." For several days the air had shuddered with accounts of the terrible suffering of our men, wounded in the Battle of the Wilderness, and a pall of uncertainty and gloom hung over the city. I made a tuck in a queen's cloth dress, donned it, selected a light satchel, put into one side a bottle of whiskey and one of sherry, half a pound of green tea, 2 rolls of bandage, and as much old table linen as packed them close, put some clothing for myself in the other side, and a cake of black Castile soap for cleansing wounds, took a pair of good scissors with one sharp point and a small rubber syringe as surgical instruments, put these in my pocket, with strings attaching them to my belt, got on my shaker bonnet and a large basket shawl and tin cup, was on board with Georgie an hour before the boat left. It had brought a load of wounded from Belle Plaine. Some were still on board and suffering intensely from thirst and hard, dry dressings. It was a hot day, and we both went to work giving drinks of water, wetting wounds, and bathing hot heads and hands. As Georgie passed the foot of the cabin stairs, Miss Dix was coming down and called to her, saying, "What are you doing here?" She made no reply, but passed on to her work, when the irate lady turned to where I was drawing water from a cooler, and asked in a tone of high displeasure, "Who is that young girl?" "Miss Georgie Willets of Jersey City," I replied. "And where is she going?" "To Fredericksburg." "By whose authority?" she demanded. "By authority of the Surgeon General," I replied. "The Surgeon General has no authority to send a young girl down there alone." "She's not going alone." "Who is going with her?" she asked tartly. "I am." "Who are you?" I told her, and she ceased to be insulting long enough to expostulate on the great impropriety of the proceeding, as well as to explain the total lack of any need of help in Fredericksburg. She had just returned from that city, where she had arranged everything in the most satisfactory manner. Hospitals had been established with surgeons and nurses. There was therefore not the slightest occasion for our going further, but she was about to organize relief for the men while waiting at the Washington wharf to be taken to hospitals. Here I might be useful, and here she would be glad to have me work. But as for that handsome young girl, she wondered at me for bringing her into such a place. Georgie was not merely handsome. She was grand, queenly, and I told Miss Dix that I differed with her about the kind of women who should go into such places. We wanted young, vigorous women whose self-respect and social position would command the respect of those to whom they ministered. She grew angry again and said, "She shall not go to Fredericksburg. I will have her arrested." I was kneeling beside a man whose wounds I was bathing, for I had not suspended my work to talk with her, who stood straight as a telegraph pole, holding a bottle which she ever and anon applied to her nose. But when she reached this climax, I raised my head, looked into her face, and said, "I shall not be sorry, Miss Dix, if you do, for then I shall apply to my friends, Mrs. Abraham Lincoln and Secretary Stanton, and have your authority tested." I went on with my work. She growled something and left the boat, but did not disturb us further. Going down the river, I grew worse, and thought I might be obliged to return with the boat and stay at home, but consulted a surgeon on his way to the front, who talked with another and said, "There is no immediate danger in your case. It is only secondary hemorrhage, and with care you may go on, but must not attempt to do anything. You can, however, be of incalculable service simply by being in Fredericksburg, can sit down and see that people do their duty. What our wounded need most is people who have an interest in their welfare, friends. You can do a great deal towards supplying this want, this great need, but be careful and do not try to work." After some time, this surgeon brought and introduced Colonel Chamberlain of Maine, evidently an invalid, and a man of the purely intellectual type. 2 other surgeons were with him, and all 3 endeavored to persuade him to return to Washington, as his lack of health made it very dangerous, if not quite useless, for him to go to the front. I thought the surgeons right, and told him I feared he was throwing away his life in an effort to do the impossible. He explained that he was in command of a brigade of 8 regiments, that in them were hundreds of his neighbors and pupils, for he had resigned a professorship in a college to enlist. Said he knew his own constitution better than anyone else could know it, knew he would be stronger when he reached his post, and that the danger would be in any attempt to keep out of danger, the danger which his men must face. Turning to me, he said, "If you had 8 children down there, you would go to them if you could." We arranged that if he should be wounded so as to suffer a thigh amputation, he should let me know, that I might nurse him through. At Belle Plaine, Georgie went to look for transportation, and I to the Sanitary Commission boat, where I was introduced to Mrs. General Barlow and Miss Hancock, both busy furnishing hot coffee to those being embarked for Washington. Mrs. Barlow was a tall, superbly formed woman, very handsome, and full of health and spirits. She looked down at me compassionately and said, "Oh, you poor little thing! Whatever brought you here? You have sick folks enough now. Do sit down until I get you a cup of tea." While I drank the tea, she stood looking at me and said meditatively, "Oh, you queer little thing," and hurried off to her work. Soon a colonel with a badly wounded head came on board, leaned against a post and groaned. I found a basin of water and a towel and began bathing his head, wetting those torturing dressings and making him comparatively comfortable, when she stopped in her hurried walk, looked on an instant, and exclaimed, "Oh, you nice little thing! Now I see what you were good for. I could not do that, but you will take care of their wounds, and I will feed them. That will be grand." Soon Georgie came to say there was no transportation to be had, but she had found a Campbell surgeon in charge of a hospital tent, and he wanted me. Said he was worn out and had plenty of work for both of us. The doctor had a large tent filled with wounded lying on loose hay. His patients seemed to want for nothing, but he must needs give so much time to receiving and forwarding those pouring in from the front that he needed us. He had a little tent put up for us, and that was the only night I ever slept in a tent. Next morning, while we were attending to a colonel and lieutenant colonel, both of the same regiment, and both badly wounded and just brought in, one said to the other, "My God, if our men in Fredericksburg could have a little of this care." "Why," said I have heard that everything possible was being done for them." "Everything possible!" exclaimed one, and both together began the most terrible recital of the neglect and abuse of the wounded in that horrible place. Men dying of thirst and women spitting in their faces, kicking and spurning them. We set down our basins. Georgie started in one direction and I in another to find transportation. The surgeon in command of the station stood superintending the loading of oats while he looked at my pass and said he could not possibly send us, adding, "Fredericksburg is no place for a lady. It is impossible to describe the condition of things there. But, doctor, I am not a lady, I am a hospital nurse. The place where men are suffering must be the place for me. I do not look strong, but you cannot think how much I can do." "But, madam, you forget that our army is cut off from its base of supplies, and must be furnished with subsistence, and that we have not half the transportation we need." "Doctor, you are sending bags of oats in ambulances. I do not weigh much more than one, and will be worth 6 when you get me there." He promised to send me that afternoon, but I doubted him. Went to the Christian Commission tent, found a man who knew me by reputation, and told him they had better send me to Fredericksburg or put me under arrest, for I was in a mood to be dangerous. He feigned fright, caught up his hat, and said, "We'll get you out of this in the shortest possible space of time." An hour after I was on the way, and Georgie a few moments in advance. I had seen bad roads in northern and western Pennsylvania, but this was my first ride over no road. We met a steady stream of such wounded as were able to walk, but comparatively few were brought in ambulances. It was raining when we reached Fredericksburg at 4:00 on Sabbath, and I went to the surgeon in command, reported, and asked him to send me to the worst place, the place where there was most need. "Then I'd better send you to the old theater, for I can get no one to stay there." He gave me my appointment, and I went to a corps surgeon who signed it, and advised me not to go to the theater. I could do nothing, as the place was in such dreadful condition, while I could be useful in many other places. End of chapter 66. Chapter 67 of Half a Century by Jane Grey SWISSHELM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. The Old Theater. This building was on Princess Anne Street. The basement floor was level with the sidewalk, but the ground sloped upward at the back, so that the yard was higher than the floor. Across the front was a vestibule, with 2 flights of stairs leading up to the auditorium. Behind the vestibule, a large low room with 2 rows of pillars supporting the upper floor, and behind this 3 small rooms and a square hall with a side entrance. The fence was down between the theater and Catholic church next door. I stopped in the church to see Georgie, who was already at work there, came and left by the back door, and entered the theater by the side hall. The mud was running in from the yard. Opposite the door in a small room was a pile of knapsacks and blankets, and on them lay 2 men smoking. To get into the large room I must step out of the hall mud over one man, and be careful not to step on another. I think it was 6 rows of men that lay close on the floor, with just room to pass between the feet of each row, they so close in the rows that in most places I must slide one foot before the other to get to their heads. The floor was very muddy and strewn with debris, principally of crackers. There was 182 men in the building, all desperately wounded. They had been there a week. There were 2 leather water buckets, 2 tin basins, and about every 3rd man had saved his tin cup or canteen, but no other vessel of any sort, size, or description on the premises, no sink or cesspool or drain. The nurses were not to be found. The men were growing reckless and despairing, but seemed to catch hope as I began to thread my way among them and talk. No other memory of life is more sacred than that of the candor with which they took me into their confidence, as if I had been one of their own sex, yet ever sought to avoid wounding the delicacy they ascribed to mine. I found some of the nurses, cowards who had run away from battle and now ran from duty, galvanized them into activity, invented substitutes for things that were wanting, making good use of an old knapsack and pocket knife, and had tears of gratitude for pay. One man lay near the front door in a scant flannel shirt and cotton drawers, his left thigh cut off in the middle, and the stump supported on the only pillow in the house. It was 6 by 10 inches, stuffed with straw. His head was supported by 2 bits of board and a pair of very muddy boots. He called me, clutched my dress, and pled, "Mother, can't you get me a blanket? I'm so cold. I could live if I could get any care." I went to the room where the men lay smoking on the blankets, but one of them, wearing a surgeon's shoulder straps and speaking in a German accent, claimed them as his private property and positively refused to yield one. The other man was his orderly, and words were useless. They kept their blankets. Going into a room behind that, I found a man slightly wounded sitting on the floor, supporting another man who had been shot across the face and was totally blind. He called, and when I came and talked with him, said, "Won't you stay with us?" "Stay with you?" I replied. "Well, I rather think I will. Indeed, I came to stay, and am one of the folks it is hard to drive away." "Oh, thank God! Everybody leaves us. They come and promise and then go off. But I know you will stay. You will do something for us." It was so pitiful that for an instant my courage failed, and I said, "I will certainly stay with you, but fear it is little I can do for you." "Oh, you can speak to us. You do not know how good your voice sounds. I have not seen a woman in 3 months. What is your name?" "My name is Mother." "Mother? Oh, my God! I have not seen my mother for 2 years. Let me feel your hand." I took between both of mine his hand, covered with mud and blood and smoke of battle, and told him I was not only going to stay with them, but was going to send him back to his regiment with a lot more who were lying around here doing nothing, when there was so much fighting to be done. I had come on purpose to make them well, and they might make up their minds to it. My own courage had revived, and I must revive theirs. I could surely keep them alive until help should come. By softening the torturing bandages on his face, I made him more comfortable, and in an adjoining room found another man with a thigh stump, who had been served by field surgeons, as the thieves served the man going from Jerusalem to Jericho. That is, they stripped him, left him naked and half dead. Those men surely did not go into battle without clothes, and why should they have been sent out of the surgeons' hands without enough of even underclothing to cover them, is the question I have never yet had answered. Common decency led to his being placed in the back room alone, but I shall never blush for going to him and doing the little I could for his comfort. After I returned to the large room, I took notice about clothing, and found that most of the men had on their ordinary uniforms. Some had 2 blankets, more had 1, but full 1/3 were without any. There was no shadow or pretense of a bed or pillow, not even a handful of straw or hay. There was no broom, no hoe or shovel or spade to sweep or scrape the floor, and the horrors were falling upon me when the man of the blankets came and said, "Madam, if you are going to do anything for these men, you better give them something to eat." "Something to eat?" "Yes, mein Gott, something to eat. The government better leave them to die on the battlefield nor to bring them here to starve." I looked at him in much surprise and said, "Who are you?" "Why, I am the surgeon. They send me here, put mine cut. I cannot do nothing. There is nothing to do mit." I called out, "Men, what have you had to eat?" "Hardtack and something they call coffee," was the response. "Have you had no meat?" "Meat? We have forgotten what it tastes like." In one corner near the front door was a little counter and desk with a stationary bench in front. To this desk the surgeon gave me a key. I found writing material and sent a note of 4 lines to the corps surgeon. Half an hour after, an irate little man stormed in and stamped around among these prostrate men, flourishing a scrap of paper and calling for the writer. His air was that of the champion who wanted to see "the man who struck Billy Patterson," and his fierceness quite alarmed me, lest he should step on some of the men. So I hurried to him, and was no little surprised to find that the offending missive was my note. I told him I had written it, and could have had no thought of reporting him, since I knew nothing about him. After considerable talk, I learned that he had charge of the meat, and that none had been issued to that place because no requisition had been sent. I had never written a requisition, but found blanks in the desk, filled one, signed it, and gave it to the meat man, who engaged that the beef should be there next morning. It grew dark, and we had 2 tallow candles lighted. May none of my readers ever see such darkness made visible, such rows of haggard faces looking at them from out such cavernous gloom. I talked hopefully, worked and walked, while mentally exclaiming, "Oh God, what shall I do?" About 9 o'clock, Dr. Porter, division surgeon, came with Georgie to take us to our quarters. These were but half a block away, on the same side of the street, but on the opposite side and corner of the next cross street, in a nice 2-story brick house with a small yard in front. An old lady answered his summons, but refused to admit us, when he insisted, and I interposed, saying the lady was afraid of soldiers, but would admit us. We would bid him good night, and soon our lodgings would be all right. She was relieved, took us in, cooked our rations for herself and us, gave us a comfortable bed, and was uniformly kind all the time we stayed, and seemed sorry to have us leave. I spoke the first night to Dr. Porter about blankets and straw or hay for beds, but was assured that none were to be had. Supplies could not reach them, since being cut off from their base, and the Provost Marshal, General Patrick, would not permit anything to be taken out of the houses, though many of them were unoccupied and well supplied with bedding and other necessities. I thought we ought to get 2 blankets for those 2 naked men, if the government should pay their weight in gold for them, and suggested that the surgeons take what was necessary for the comfort of the men, and give vouchers to the owners. I knew such claims would be honored, would see that they should be, but he said the matter had been settled by the provost, and nothing more could be done. It seems to me now that I must have been benumbed, or I could have done something to provide covering for those men. I did think of giving one of them my shawl, but I must have died without it. I remembered my Douglas Hospital letter, and knew that General Patrick could order me out of Fredericksburg, and leave these men to rot in the old theater. Already their wounds were infested by worms, which gnawed and tormented them. Some of those wounds were turning black, many were green. The vitality of the men was sinking for want of food and warmth. I could not forsake them to look after reform, would not fail to do what I could, in an effort to do what I could not or might not accomplish. In the morning I saw that the men had something they called coffee, and found canned milk for it, which was nourishment, but a new difficulty arose. The men who brought the coffee would distribute it to those who had cups or canteens, and the others would get none. I had some trouble to induce them to leave their cans, until, with the 2 tin cups I could borrow, I could give about 1/3 of the whole number the coffee they could not otherwise have. Our cooking was done in the churchyard with that of the church patients. A shed had been put up, but our cooking was an uncovenanted mercy, and when our beef came there was a question as to how it could be cooked, how that additional work could be done. I wrote to the Provost Marshal, stating our trouble and the extremity of 182 men, asked that we might take a cook stove out of a vacant house near, promised to take good care of it and have it returned, and he wrote for answer, "I am not a thief. If you want a stove, send to the Sanitary Commission." He must have known that the commission was as pressed as the government to conform its arrangements to the movements of an army cut off from its base of supplies, and that it had no stoves, so the plain English of his answer was, "Let your wounded die of hunger in welcome. I am here to guard the property of the citizens of Fredericksburg." I had already written to the commission for blankets and a broom, and there was none to be had. It soon, however, sent a man who cut branches off trees and with them swept the floors. End of chapter 67. Chapter 68 of Half a Century by Jane Grey SWISSHELM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Am placed in authority. On Monday morning I sent for Dr. Porter and stated the trouble about nurses shirking. He had them all summoned in the front end of the large room, and in presence of the patients said to them, "You see this lady? Well, you are to report to her for duty, and if she has any fault to find with you, she will report you to the provost marshal." I have never seen a set of men look more thoroughly subdued. There were 11 of them, and they all gave me the military salute. The doctor went off, and I set them to work. One middle-aged Irishman had some experience as a nurse, could dress wounds, slowly but very well, was faithful and kind, and him I made head nurse upstairs, where there were 54 patients, and gave him 3 assistants, for whom he was to be responsible. After Patrick's note, I calculated my resources and got ready for a close siege. As I sat on that little stationary bench, making an inventory, I heard shrieks, groans, and curses at the far end of the room, ran to the place, and got there in time to see the surgeon of the blankets tearing the dry dressings off a thigh stump. Coming up behind him, I caught him by both ears, and had my hands full, ordered him to stop, and said, "You had better go back to your room and smoke." Again I sent for Surgeon Porter, and in less than 2 hours that little wretch with his orderly packed up his blankets, and I saw him or them no more. I had never dressed a thigh stump, but must dress a good many now. I rolled that one in a wet cloth and covered it carefully to let the man get time to rest while I got rid of his horrid tormentor. When there was so much to be done, I would do the most needful thing first, and this was ridding the wounds of worms and gangrene, supporting the strength of the men by proper food, and keeping the air as pure as possible. I got our beef into the way of being boiled, and would have some good substantial broth made around it. I went on a foraging expedition, found a coal scuttle which would do for a slop pail, and confiscated it, got 2 bits of board by which it could be converted into a stool, and so bring the great rest of a change of position to such men as could sit up, had a little drain made with a bit of board for a shovel, and so kept the mud from running in at the side door, melted the tops off some tin cans and made them into drinking cups, had 2 of my men confiscate a large tub from a brewery, set it in the vestibule to wash rags for outside covers to wounds, to keep off chill, and had others bring bricks and rubbish mortar from a ruin across the street to make substitutes for pillows. I dressed wounds, and made thorough work of it. In the church was a dispensary where I could get any washes or medicines I wished, and I do not think I left a worm. Some of them were over half an inch long, with black heads and many feet, but most were maggots. They were often deeply seated, but my syringe would drive them out, and twice a day I followed them up. The black and green places grew smaller and better colored with every dressing. The men grew stronger, with plenty of beef and broth and canned milk. I put citric acid and sugar in their apple sauce as a substitute for lemons. I forget how many thigh stumps I had, but I think as many as 12. One of them was very short and in a very bad condition. One morning when I was kneeling and dressing it, the man burst into tears and said, "You do not seem to mind this, but I know you would not do it for anything but the love of God, and none but He can ever reward you. But if I live to see my wife and children, it will be through what you have done for me, and I will teach them to bless your name." He quite took me by surprise, for I seemed to have forgotten any other life than that I was then living, and dressing the most frightful wounds was as natural as eating. I felt no disgust, no shrinking, and mere conventional delicacy is withdrawn when the angel of death breathes upon it. The man we stepped over at the back door proved to be a student from the Pennsylvania Agricultural College, shot through the alimentary canal near the base of the spine. For him there was no hope, but I did what I could to make him less uncomfortable, and once he said, "This is strange work for a lady." "You forget," I said, "that I am surgeon in charge, that you and I were made of the same kind of clay, in much the same fashion, and will soon turn into just the same kind of dust." How my heart was wrung for him, with his refined face, dying for a country which sent its bayonets to stand between him and the armful of straw with which I might have raised him above that muddy floor. He had no knapsack to serve as a pillow, no blanket, no cup, and his position across the doorway was cold and uncomfortable, but even after I had made a better place for him, he objected to leaving 2 companions who lay next to him, and I could not find room for all 3 together, even on that dirty floor. He himself always dressed the wound where the bullet entered, and was most grateful for the means of doing so. I cared for that one through which death's messenger made its exit, and although he knew its condition, he did not know the certainty of a fatal result, and resented any intimation that he should not recover. End of chapter 68. Chapter 69 of Half a Century by Jane Grey SWISSHELM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Visitors. The second morning of my work in the old theater, Miss Hancock came to see how I got along. She was thoroughly practical, and a most efficient laborer in the hospital field, and soon thought of something to better the condition of the man minus clothes, who lay quite near my desk and the front door, and caught my dress whenever he could, to plead for a blanket. She could get no blanket, but was stationed in the Methodist church, where there was a surgeon in charge and everything running in regular order. In a tent adjoining, this man could be laid out of the draught and chill of that basement, and she would do her best to get some clothing for him. She sent 2 men with a stretcher, who took him to the church tent, where I fear he was not much better provided for than in the place he left. After some days, Mrs. General Barlow came to see the men, who all belonged to her husband's division, and were rejoiced to see her, and to express a general fear for my life. I was to die of overwork and want of sleep, and then she exclaimed, "What will become of these men? No one but you ever could or would have done anything for them. Do you know there were 3 surgeons detailed for duty here before you came, and none of them would stay. Now if you die, they will. Do take some rest." I listened and looked at her flushed face while she talked, and said, "Mrs. Barlow, I am not going to die, am in no danger whatever, and will hold out until help comes. This cannot last. Government will come to the rescue, and my men will be here when it comes. After all is over, I will fall to pieces like an old stagecoach when the king bolt drops out. Will lie around as lumber for a while, then someone will put me together again, and I will be as good as new. It is you who are killing yourself. You must change your arrangements, or you will take typhoid fever, and after such a strain, recovery will be hopeless. I take nobody's disease, and am too repellent, but you will catch contagion very readily. Keep away from fever cases and rest. You are in imminent peril." She hurried away, laughing at the idea of one in her perfect health being injured by hard work, but my heart was full of evil omen. I had talked with Mrs. Senator Pomeroy on her way from her last visit to the contraband camp, where she gave her life in labor for the friendless and poor, and she had looked very much as Mrs. Barlow did that day. Soon after this, I was made glad by the sight of my friend, Mrs. Judge Ingersoll. People say her daughter, Mrs. Governor Chamberlain, is a beauty, but she is not old enough ever to have been as beautiful as her mother. That day, in her plain widow's dress, walking among the wounded with her calm face so full of strength and gentleness, she and Mrs. Barlow had hatched a rebellion. In the city was a barn containing straw, for want of which our men were dying. It was guarded by one of General Barlow's men. Mrs. Barlow took 2 others, went with them, placed herself in front of the guard, told them to break open the barn and carry out the straw, and him to fire if he thought it his duty, but he must reach them through her. The man's orders were to guard the barn. With the straw out of it he had nothing to do. The men moved side and side, going in and out, and she kept in range to cover them until the last armful had been removed. It was taken away and was to be distributed, but there was still so little compared to the need that there must be consultation about the manner of using it. Mrs. Ingersoll thought it should be made into small pillows and volunteered to undertake that work. As the commission could furnish muslin, I thought this best. She found a loft and engaged several Fredericksburg women to work for pay. They worked one day but did not return on the second. There were a good many Union women there by this time who should have helped, but few could confine themselves to obscure work in a loft when there was so much excitement on the streets. There was no authority to hold anyone to steady employment, and so about 2/3 the helpers who reached Fredericksburg spent a large part of their time in an aimless wandering and wondering, and finding so much to be done, could do nothing. So most of the time Mrs. Ingersoll was in her loft alone, except the orderlies who stuffed her slips, sewed up the ends, and carried them off to the places she designated. But she had nimble fingers and sleight of hand, and turned out a surprising number of small straw pillows. As my allowance came, the question was what to do with them. They were too precious for use. What should I do with those scraps of white on that field of grime? Our gaunt horror became grotesque in view of such unwonted luxuries. What? A whole dozen or two little straw pillows among 260 men? Who should select the aristocrats to be cradled in such luxury amid that world of want? When my aristocrat was elected, how should his luxury be applied? Would I put it under his head or mangled limb? I think I never realized our destitution until those little pillows came to remind me that sometimes wounded men had beds. Oh God, would relief never come? Like the Scotch girl in the besieged fortress of India, I felt like laying my ear to the ground to hearken for the sound of the bagpipes, the tramp of the Campbells coming. It did seem that without surgical aid or comforts of any kind, my men must soon be all past hope. But a surgeon came, and I hailed him with joy, thinking him the advance guard of the army of relief. Half an hour after his appearance I missed him, and saw him no more, and this was the fourth which left those men, after being regularly detailed to duty among them, left them to die or live as they could. Soon after this we had an official visit from one of those laundry critics called medical inspectors. As there were no sheets or counterpanes to look after, he turned his attention to a heap of dry rubbish in the vestibule, which gave the place an untidy appearance as seen from the street. To remove this eyesore he had one of my nurses hunt up a wheelbarrow and 2 shovels. The shovels were accessible by this time, and ordered him and another to wheel that rubbish out into the street. The wheelbarrow coming in the door called my attention when I learned we were going to be made respectable. I sent the wheelbarrow home, gave the shovels to 2 men to dig a sinkhole back in the yard, and forbade any disturbance of the dry, harmless rubbish in the vestibule. I would not have my men choked with dust by its removal, and set about getting up false appearances. No medical inspector should white that sepulchre until he cleared the dead men's bones out of it. He had not looked at a wound, did not know if the men had had any dinner. A man did not need a medical diploma to clear up after stage carpenters. If the government wanted that kind of work done, it had better send a man and cart with its donkey. End of chapter 69. Chapter 70 of Half a Century by Jane Grey SWISSHELM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Wounded officers. In Washington I had done nothing for any wounded officer except a captain who was brought to our ward when all of the others were taken away, and in Fredericksburg I began on that principle. I found 20 in the old theater, and had them removed to private houses to make room for the men, and that they might be better cared for. Officers could be quartered in private houses and have beds. Most of those taken out of the theater were put into houses between it and our quarters, so that I could see them on my way to and from meals. Among them was the blind man, who still craved to hear me speak and feel my hand, and I kept his face in a wet compress until a surgeon was dressing it, and found the inflammation so gone that he drew the lid of one back, and the man cried out in delight, I can see, now let me see mother." I stood in his range of vision until the surgeon closed the lids, when he said, "Now, mother, I shall always remember just how you look." I found in my visit to those men that some orderlies needed someone to keep them in order, and that a helpless man is not always sure his servant will serve him. Often the orderlies themselves were powerless, and those men would have suffered if I had not cared for them. More than once some of them said, "I wish, mother, we were back with you in the old theater." There was a captain whose stump I must fix every night before he could sleep, and when his wife came I tried to teach her, but she was so much afraid of hurting him she could do nothing. I learned in time that officers quartered in private houses, even with the greater comforts they had, often suffered more than the men in all their privations. Mrs. Barlow came for me to see one given up to die, and I found him in a large, handsome room on the first floor of an elegant residence, absolutely hopeless, but for years have not been able to recall the trouble in his case. It must have been easy to set right, for he began at once to recover, and I felt that people had been very stupid, and that there was an unreasonable amount of wonder and gratitude over whatever it was I did. It was often so easy to save a life where there were the means of living, that a little courage or common sense seemed like a miraculous gift to people whose mental powers had been turned in other directions. But I found another side to looking after officers in private quarters. One evening after dark, Georgie called to tell me of a dreadful case of suffering which a surgeon wished her to see. He was there to accompany her, but she declined going without me, and I went along, walking close behind them as the pavement was narrow. He did not seem to notice that I was there, was troubled with the weight of his diploma and shoulder straps, and talked very patronizingly to the lady at his side until she turned and said to me, "Do you hear that?" "Oh, yes," I replied, "and feel very grateful to the young man for his permission to do the work he is paid for doing, but if he had reserved his patronage until someone had asked for it, it would have had more weight." "Your friend is sarcastic," was his reply to her, and I said no more until we reached the case of great distress, which was on the second floor of a vacant house, and proved to be a colonel in uniform, seated in an easy chair, smoking, while his orderly sat in another chair on the other side of the room. Georgie stood looking from one man to the other in speechless surprise, but I spoke to the man in the chair, saying, "How is it, sir, that you, an officer in need of nothing, have trespassed upon our time and strength, when you know that men are dying by hundreds for want of care?" He began to apologize and explain, but I said to Georgie, "Come, Miss Willets, we are not needed here." As we passed from the room, the surgeon took his cap to accompany us, when I stopped, made a gesture, and said, "Young man, stay where you are. Your friend must be too ill to do without you. I will see the young lady to her quarters. The vidette is on the corner, and we do not need you." We came away filled with wonder, but we did not for some time realize the danger. We came to know that Miss Dix's caution was not altogether unwise, that women had been led into traps of this kind, when it would have been well for them had they died there, and when duty to themselves and the public required them to get one or more doctors ready for dissection. After that lesson, however, I did not fear to leave Georgie, who remained with the army doing grand work until Richmond fell, but laying the foundation of that consumption of which he died. Of all the lives which the rebellion cost us, none was more pure, more noble than that of this beautiful, refined, strong, gentle girl. End of chapter 70. Chapter 71 of Half a Century by Jane Grey SWISSHELM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Now I lay me down to sleep. The Sanitary Commission soon got a supply of clothing and sent 2 men to wash and dress my patients. These, with the one sweeping floors with branches, were an incalculable help and comfort. But these 2 did their work and passed on to other places. One of the men they had dressed grew weak, and I was at a loss to account for his symptoms, until by close questioning I drew from him the answer. "It is my other wound." These words sounded like a death knell, but I insisted on seeing the other wound and found 4 bullet holes under his new clothes. From the one wound for which I had been caring he might easily recover, but with 4 more so distributed that he must lie on one, and no surgeon to make trapdoors, no bed, there was no hope. He was so bright, so good, so intelligent, so courageous, it was hard to give him up. Ah, if I had him in Campbell with Dr. Kelly to use the knife, how my heart clung to him. He lay near the center of the room with his head close to a column, and one night as I knelt giving him drink and arranging his knapsack and brick pillow, making the most of his 2 blankets and thinking of his mother at home, I was suddenly impressed by the beauty and grandeur of his face. His broad white brow shaded by bushy chestnut hair, half curling, the delicate oval of his cheeks, the large expressive gray eyes, the straight nose and firm chin and lips. He could not have been more than 22, almost 6 feet high, with a frame full of vigor. How many such men were there in this land? How many could we afford to sacrifice in order to preserve a country for the use of cowards and traitors and other inferior types of the race? The feeble light of my candle threw this picture into strong relief against the surrounding gloom, and it was harder than ever to give him up. But this must be done. And I wanted to extract from that bitter cup 1 drop of sweetness for his mother, so I said to him, "Now, George, do you think you can sleep?" He said he could, and I added, "Will you pray before you sleep?" He said he would. "Do you always pray before going to sleep?" He nodded, and I continued, "Let us pray together tonight, just the little prayer your mother taught you first." He clasped his hands, and together we repeated, "Now I lay me down to sleep," to the end, when I said, "Do you mean that, George? Do you mean to ask God to keep your soul for Christ's sake while you are here, and for His sake to take it to Himself when you go hence, whenever that may be?" The tears were running over his cheeks, and he said solemnly, "I do." "Then it is all well with you, and you can rest in Him who giveth His beloved sleep." There was no time for long prayers, and I must go to another sufferer. A kind, strong man from the Michigan Aid Society came and worked 2 days among my men and said, "If I had only had them in a tent on the ground, but this floor is dreadful." Upstairs were some wounds I must dress, while a corpse lay close beside one of the men, so that I must kneel touching it while I worked. It lay 12 hours before I could get it taken to its shallow, coffinless grave, and while I knelt there, the man whose wound I was dressing said, "Never mind, we'll make you up a good purse for this." He had no sooner spoken than a murmur of contemptuous disapproval came from the other men, and one said, "A purse for her? She's got more money than all of us, I bet." Another called out, "No, we won't do anything of the kind. We're your boys, ain't we, Mother? You're not working for money." "Why," persisted the generous man, "we made up a purse of $80 for a woman the other time I was hurt, and she hadn't done half as much for us." $80, called out the man who thought me rich. $80 for her! Why, I tell you she could give every one of us $80 and would not miss it. Another said, "She isn't one of the sort that are round after purses." Why any of them should have thought me rich I cannot imagine, except for the respect with which officers treated me. To veil the iron hand I held over my nurses, I made a jest of my authority, pinned a bit of bandage on my shoulder, and played commander-in-chief. Officers and guards would salute when we passed, as an innocent joke, but the men came to regard me as a person of rank. Citizens of Fredericksburg, who at first insulted me on the street as they did other Yankee nurses, heard that I was a person of great influence, and began to solicit my good offices on behalf of friends arrested by order of Secretary Stanton and held as hostages for our 60 wounded men, who were made prisoners while trying to pass through the city before we took possession. So I was decked in plumes of fictitious greatness, and might have played princess in disguise if I had had time, but I had only 2 deaths in the old theater. This man upstairs, and the man without clothes, who lay alone in that back room, and after the amputation of his thigh, had no covering until government gave him one of Virginia clay. End of chapter 71. Chapter 72 of Half a Century by Jane Grey SWISSHELM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. More victims and a change of base. One day at noon the air thrilled with martial music, and the earth shook under the tramp of men as 7,000 splendid troops marched up Princess Anne Street on their way to reinforce our army, whose rear was about 8 miles from us. They were in superb order, and the forts around Washington had been stripped of their garrisons and most of their guns to furnish them, but the generalship which cut our army off from its base of supplies and blundered into the battle of the Wilderness like a blind horse into a briar patch, without shelling or burning the dry chaparral in which our dead and wounded were consumed together, after the battle had made no arrangements for the safe arrival of its reinforcements. So they were ambushed soon after passing through Fredericksburg, and that night, before 10 o'clock, all the places I had succeeded in making vacant were filled with the wounded from this reinforcement. How many of them were brought to Fredericksburg I do not know, but it must have been a good many, when some were sent to my den of horrors. One evening after dark I went to the dispensary and found a surgeon just in from the front for supplies. While they were being put up, he told us of the horrible carnage at Spotsylvania that day, when the troops had been hurled again and again against impregnable fortifications under a rain of rifle balls, which cut down a solid white oak tree 18 inches in diameter. The battle had ceased for the night, and it was not known whether it would be renewed in the morning. "But if it is," said the speaker, "it will be the bloodiest day of the war, and we must be whipped, routed. The rebels are behind breastworks which cannot be carried. Any man but Grant would have known that this morning, but he is to fight it out on this line, and it is generally thought he will try again in the morning. If he does, it will be a worse rout than Bull Run." No one was present but the surgeon in charge of the church, the dispensary clerk, and myself, so he was no alarmist, for when he had done speaking, he took his package, mounted his horse, and left. People had said through the day that the roar of guns was heard in the higher portions of the city, but no news of the battle seemed to have reached it during all the next day. I spent it in preparing for the worst, warned Georgie, and tightened the reins on my nurses. I had had no reason to complain of any, and felt that I should hold them to duty, even through a rout. It also seemed well to know where our wounded were located, in that part of the city, so that if an attempt were made to remove them in a hurry, there might not be any overlooked. At 11:30 that night I had heard nothing from the front, and went to sleep with heavy forebodings. At 2 o'clock I was aroused by the sounds of a moving multitude, rose and looked out to see under the starlight a black stream pouring down the side street, on the corner of which our quarters were situated, and turning down Princess Anne toward the river landing. To me, it was the nation going to her doom, passing through the little period of starlight on into the darkness and the unknown. In Louisville, I had learned to believe that the eternal verities demanded the destruction of our government. True, the South had beaten the North in her bloody struggle for the privilege of holding her slaves while she flogged them, but I could see in this no reason why the North should be chosen as freedom's standard-bearer. Our ignoble Emancipation Proclamation had furnished no rock of moral principle on which to plant her feet while she struggled in that bloody surf. God was blotting out our name from among the nations, that he might plant here a government worthy of such a country. I calculated there was a rear guard that would hold the enemy back until morning, and did not wake Georgie, who needed sleep, but I must be with my men, who would be alarmed by the unusual sounds, must see that these nurses did not run away. To get to my post, I must cross that stream, and as I stood waiting on the bank, could see that it was not composed of men in martial array. It met exactly all my previous conceptions of a disorderly flight. There were men in and out of uniforms, men rolled in blankets, men on horseback and men on foot, cannon, caissons, baggage wagons, beef cattle, ambulances, and nondescripts, all mixed and mingled, filling the street from wall to wall, no one speaking a word, and all intent on getting forward as fast as possible. So thickly were they packed that I waited in vain as much as 20 minutes for some opening through which I might work my way to the other side, and at last called the vidette, who came and helped me over. Reaching the theatre, I found many of the men awake and listening, went among them and whispered, as I did something for each, that there was some movement on the street I did not understand, but should probably know about in the morning. During the suspense of those dark hours, and all the next day, I was constantly reminded of the Bible metaphor of a nail fastened in a sure place. The absolute confidence which those men reposed in me, the comfort and strength I could give them, were so out of proportion to my strength that it was a study. I was a very small nail, but so securely fastened in the source of all strength that they could hold by me in hope, even when there seemed nothing to hope for. As for me, all the armies of the world, and the world itself, might melt or blow away, but I should be safe with God, and know that for every creature he was working out some noble destiny. All the pain and sorrow and defeat were rough places, briars in an upward path to something we should all rejoice to see. All day that dark stream surged around that corner, and I took heart that the flight was not disorderly, since I heard of none coming by any other street. All day the work went on as usual at the old theatre, and I made short excursions to other places. Up that street, in one end of an engine house, up a narrow winding stair, I found a room full of men, deserted and in a most pitiable condition. They were all supposed to be fever cases, but one young man had an ankle wound in which inflammation had appeared. I hurried to the surgeons stationed in the far end of the building and reported the case. They sent immediately for the man, and I knew in 2 hours that the amputation had been successful, and barely in time. As I went on that errand, I met 2 Christian Commission men walking leisurely, admiring the light of the rising sun on the old buildings, and told them of the urgent demand for help, and chicken broth or beef broth and water up in that room. They were polite and promised to go as soon as possible to the relief of that distress, but when I returned, and up to the last knowledge I had of the case, they had not been there. I secured a can of cooked turkey, the only one I ever saw, and a pitcher of hot water, and with these made a substitute for chicken broth, and gave them all drinks of water, bathed their faces, found one of their absent nurses, made him promise to stay, and went back to the main building to have someone see that he kept his word. Here was a large floor almost covered with wounded, and among them a woman stumbled about, weeping, wailing, boo-hooing, and wringing her hands. I caught her wrist and said, "What is the matter?" "Oh, oh, oh, boo-hoo, boo-hoo, the poor fellow is going to die and wants me to write to his mother." "Well, write to her and keep quiet. Need not kill all the rest of them because he's going to die." "Oh, boo-hoo, some people have no feelin's, but I got feelin's." I led her to the surgeon in charge, who sent her and her feelin's to her quarters and told her not to come back. She was the only one of the Dix nurses I saw in Fredericksburg, and her large, flat, flabby face was almost hideous with its lack of eyebrows and lashes, but this hideousness must have been her recommendation, as she could not have been more than 20 years old. From the engine house I went to the Methodist church. Miss Hancock had been detailed to the General Hospital, just being established, and I found a house full of men in sad condition. 9 o'clock on a hot morning, and no wounds dressed, bandages dry and hard, men thirsty and feverish, nurses out watching that stream pouring through the city, and patients helpless and despondent. I got a basin of water and a clean rag, never cared for sponges, and went from one to another, dripping water in behind those bandages to ease the torment of lint splints, brought drinks and talked to call their attention from the infinite dread which filled the air, and got up considerable interest in, I do not remember what, but something which set them to talking. Some wounds I dressed, and while engaged on one, a man called from the other side of the house to know what the fun was all about, when the man whose wound I was attending placed a hand on each of his sides, screamed with laughter, and replied, "Oh, Jim, do get her to dress your wound, for I swear she'd make a dead man laugh." I found some of the nurses. A surgeon came in who would, I thought, attend to them, and I went back to my post to find every man on duty. It was near sundown when we heard that this backward movement was a change of base, but to me it seemed more like looking for a base, as there had been none to change. The stream thickened toward nightfall and continued until 2:00 next morning, so that our army was 24 hours passing through Fredericksburg, and in that time I do not think a man strayed off onto any other street. All poured down that side street, turned that corner, and went on down Princess Anne. End of chapter 72. Chapter 73 of Half a Century by Jane Grey SWISSHELM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Prayers enough and to spare. The next evening, after hearing of the Battle of Spotsylvania, and while waiting to know if it had been renewed, I sat after sundown on the doorstep of our quarters, when an orderly hurried up and inquired for the Christian Commission. A lieutenant was dying and wanted to see a preacher. I directed the messenger, but doubted if he would find a preacher, as I had seen nothing of any save a Catholic priest, with whom I had formed an alliance, and I went to stay with the dying man, who was alone. I found him nervous and tired, with nothing to hinder his return to his regiment inside of a month. He had been converted, was a member of the Methodist Church, and seemed an humble Christian man. I told him he was getting well, had seen too much company, and must go to sleep, which he proceeded to do in a very short time, after being assured that motion was in order. He had slept perhaps 5 minutes when the messenger returned, followed by 6 preachers. I made a sign that he slept and should not be disturbed, but they gathered round the bed with so much noise they waked him. There seemed to be a struggle for precedence among his visitors, but one gained the victory. They all wanted to shake hands with the man in the bed, but his left arm was off, and I objected, whereupon the head spokesman groaned a good solid groan, to which the others groaned a response. He stood at the foot of the bed, spread his chest, and inquired, "Well, brother, how is your soul in this solemn hour?" The answer was such as a good Christian might make, and I told the gentleman that the lieutenant had been unnecessarily alarmed, that he had seen too much company, was wearied and excited, needed rest, and was rapidly recovering, that he ought to go to sleep. But they all knelt round the bed, and the first prayed a good, long, loud prayer, talked about the lake that burneth, and other pleasant things, while I held the patient's hand and felt his nerves jerk. I thought it would soon be over, but no sooner had this one finished than the next fell to, and gave us a prayer with more of those sobs made by hard inhalation than his predecessor, and a good deal more brimstone. No sooner had he relieved his mind than a third threw back his head to begin, and I spoke quietly as possible, begged they would let the lieutenant sleep, told them that down in the old theater was a man in a back room alone and dying. I had tried to get someone to sit with him and pray with him, and hoped 1 or 2 of them would go to him at once, as every moment might make it too late. A man was also dying in the engine house, who ought to have some Christian friend with him as he crossed the dark valley. They listened impatiently. Then the man whose turn it was to ventilate his eloquence pushed his sleeves up to the elbows, rubbed his hands as if about to lift some heavy weight, and exclaimed, "Yes, sister, yes, we'll attend to them. But first let us get through with this case." Then he went to work and ladled out groans, sobs, and blue blazes. The other 3 followed suit, and when they had all had a good time on their knees, each one gave a short oration, and when they got through I reminded them again of the 2 dying men, but like the undutiful son they said, "I go," and went not. It was 2 of the 6 whom I met next morning and asked to go to the relief of these poor patients who promised and went not. End of chapter 73. Chapter 74 of Half a Century by Jane Grey SWISSHELM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Get out of the old theater. I do not know how long I was in charge of the old theater, but remember talking to someone of having been there 10 days and things looking as usual. It was after the change of base that one afternoon I got 8 hopeful cases sent to the General Hospital, where they would have beds. That night about 10 o'clock the vidette halted a man who explained that he was surgeon in charge of that institution, and when he got leave to go on I caught him by the lapel of his coat and said, "If you are a surgeon, what is the reason that 8 men I sent you this afternoon had had no supper at 9 o'clock? He promised to attend to them before he slept, and on that we parted. Soon after this, Dr. Childs of Philadelphia and a regular army surgeon came to the old theater, hung their coats in official dignity, if they had any, on the wall, never said a word about the rubbish in the hall, but fastened up their sleeves and went to work. When they came, I felt as if I could not take another step, went to my room and lay down, thinking of Raphael's useless angels leaning their baby arms on a cloud. My angels wore beards and had their sleeves turned up like farm laborers, as they lifted men out of the depths of despair into the light and warmth of human help and human sympathy. In sending the men away, they sent the amputation cases and George to the church and sent for me to go to them there. Georgie had gone to the General Hospital, and there was no surgeon in charge at the church when I went to it. So once more I set about doing that which was right in my own eyes. I could have a bale of hay, whipped out my needle and thread, and for several bad cases who had 2 blankets, converted one into a bed tick, had it filled with hay, and a man placed on it. But 3 were sadly in need of beds and had no blankets, and to them I allotted the balance of my precious bale, had it placed under them loose, and rejoiced in their joy over so great a luxury. My theater men had been laid in a row close to the wall next to the late scene of their suffering, and about midnight of the first night there a nurse asked me to go to a man who was dying. I found him in front of the altar. The doors and front panels of the pews had been fastened V-shaped to the floor, and he lay with one arm over this and his head hanging forward. He had been shot through the chest, was breathing loud and in gasps, worn out for want of support, and to lay him down was to put out his lamp of life instantly. What he needed was a high-backed chair, but General Patrick's sense of duty to the citizens of Fredericksburg left no hope of such a support. As the only substitute in my reach, I sat on the edge of the pew door in its panel, threw his arm across my knee, raised his head to my shoulder, and held it there by laying mine against it. In this way I could talk in a low monotone to him, and the hopes to which the soul turns when about to leave the tenement of clay. He gasped acquiescence to these hopes, and his words led several men near to draw their sleeves across their eyes. But they all knew he was dying, and a little sympathy and sadness would not injure them. He reached toward the floor, and the man next handed up a daguerreotype case which he tried to open. I took and opened it, found the picture of a young handsome woman, and held it and a candle so that he could see it. His tears fell on it as he looked, and he gasped, "I shall never be where that has been." I said, "Is it your wife?" And he replied, "No, but she would have been." I always tried to avoid bringing sadness to the living on account of death, but it must have been hard for men to sleep in sound of his labored breathing, and to soften it I began singing Shining Shore. He took it up at once in a whisper tone, keeping time as if used to singing. Soon one, then another and another joined, until all over the church those prostrate men were singing that soft, sad melody. On the altar burned a row of candles before a life-sized picture of the Virgin and Child. The cocks crew the turn of the night outside, and when we had sung the hymn through, some of the men began again, and we had sung it a second time when I heard George call me. I knew that he too was dying and would probably not hear the next crowing of the cock. I must go to him. How could I leave his head unsupported? O death, where is thy sting? I think it was with me that night, but I went to George, and when the sun arose it looked upon 2 corpses, the remains of 2, who had gone from my arms in one night, full of hope in the great hereafter. End of chapter 74. Chapter 75 of Half a Century by Jane Grey SWISSHELM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Take boat and see a social party. Next morning, a new surgeon took charge and ordered that hay to be removed. The men clung to their beds and sent for me. I pled a respite in hopes of getting muslin to make ticks, but was soon detected in the act of taking a bowl of broth to one of my patients. This the surgeon forbade on the ground that it was not regular mealtime. I said the man was asleep at mealtime. This he would not permit. Men must be fed at regular hours or not at all, and the new authority informed me that more wounded soldiers had been killed by women stuffing them than by anything else. He had just come from Massachusetts, and this was his first day among the wounded. I set my bowl down before the altar, found a surgeon who ranked him, and stated the case, when the higher authority said, "Give every man an ox every day if he will take it in beef tea." "But, doctor, there is nothing in beef tea." "I give broth." "Very good. Give them whatever you please and whenever you please. We can trust you." The new surgeon was promptly dismissed, and when next I saw him, he was on his way back to Massachusetts. That night a nurse came for me to go to the theater, which had been vacated, and once more almost filled with men who lay in total darkness, without having any provision made for them. I got them lights, nurses, and food, but could not go back for another siege in that building, could not leave my present post. But the city was being evacuated. Both theater and church were emptied, and I went to the tobacco warehouse, where Mrs. Ingersoll was perplexed about a man with a large bullet in his brain. When I had seen him and assured her that another ounce of lead in a skull of that kind was of no consequence, she redoubled her care, and I have no doubt he is living yet. But there was one man in whom I felt a deep interest, and for whom I saw little hope. He had a chest wound, and had seemed to be doing well when there was a hemorrhage, and he lay white and still, almost as death. He must not attempt to speak, and I was a godsend to him, for I knew what he needed without being told, and gave him the best care I could. He was of a Western state, and his name was Dutton, and when I left him I thought he must die in being moved, as he must be soon, but I must go with a boatload of wounded. This boat was a mere transport, and its precious freight was laid on the decks as close as they could well be packed, the cabin floor being given up to the wounded officers. There were several surgeons on board who may have been attending to the men, but cannot remember seeing any but one engaged in any kind of that work. There were also 7 lady nurses, all I think volunteers, all handsomely if not elegantly dressed. Of course they could do nothing there, and I cannot see how they could have done anything among the wounded in any place where there were no bedsteads to protect the men from their hoops. They had probably been engaged in preparing food, taking charge of and distributing supplies, and other important work, for personal attendance on the men was but a part of the work to be done. Surgeons could do little without soiling their uniforms, but my dress had long been past soiling or spoiling. My old kid slippers without heels could be slid with the foot in them quite under a man, and as I stepped sideways across them, they took care that my soft dress did not catch on their buttons. When I sat on one heel to bathe a hot face, give a drink, or dress a wound, some man took hold of me with his well hand and steadied me, while another held my basin. I had half of an old knapsack to put under a wound, keep the floor dry, and catch the worms when I drove them out, and no 20 early birds ever captured so many in the same length of time. I became so eager in the pursuit that I kept it up by candlelight until late midnight, when I started to go to my stateroom. Entering the cabin, I came upon a social party, the like of which I trust no one else will ever see. On the sofas sat those 7 lady nurses, each with the arm of an officer around her waist, in full view of the wounded men on the floor, some of whom must go from that low bed to one still lower, even down under the daisies. I stopped, uttered some exclamation, then stood in speechless surprise. 3 surgeons released the ladies they were holding, came forward, and inquired if there was anything wanted. I might have replied that men and women were wanted, but think I said nothing. When I reached my room, I found in the berth a woman who raised up and said, "The stewardess told me this was your room. Will you let me stay with you?" She was another Georgie. Young, calm, strong, refined was Miss Gray of Columbia Hospital, and stayed with me through a long, hard trial, in which she proved that her price was above rubies. Next morning I found one of the guards, young Johnson, the son of an old Wilkinsburg schoolmate, hoped I had so checked the decay and final destroyers which had already taken hold of him that he might live. Wrote to his people, and saw him at noon transferred with the other patients, the surgeons, and stylish lady nurses to a large hospital boat, when Miss Gray and I returned in the transport to Fredericksburg. End of chapter 75. Chapter 76 of Half a Century by Jane Grey SWISSHELM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Take final leave of Fredericksburg. I cannot remember if our boat lay at the Fredericksburg wharf 1 day or 2, but she might start any moment, and those who went ashore took the risk of being left, as this was the last boat. The evacuation was almost complete, and we waited the result of expeditions to gather up our wounded from field hospitals at the front. We were liable to attack at any moment, and were protected by a gunboat which lay close alongside. There was plenty to do on board, but in doing it I must see the piles of stores on the wharf, brought there too late to be of service to our wounded, and now to be abandoned to the rebels. There were certainly 100 bales of hay, which would have more than replaced all that was withheld by the United States bayonets from our own men in their extremity. I soon learned, after entering Fredericksburg, that our commissaries were issuing stores without stint to the citizens. Went and saw them carry off loads of everything there was to give, and when those 182 Union soldiers were literally starving in the old theater, Union soldiers were dealing out delicacies to rebels, while others guarded the meanest article of their property and kept it from our men, even when it was necessary to save life. I consulted several old Sanitary Commission men who told me that it was always so when Grant was at the front, that he was then in absolute command, that Patrick, the provost marshal, was his friend and would be sustained, and that we must be quiet or we would be ordered out of Fredericksburg. General Grant may have been loyal to the Union cause, but it has always seemed to me that in fighting its battles he was moved by the pure love of fighting, and took that side which could furnish him the most means to gratify his passion for war. His generalship was certainly of a kind that would soon have proved fatal to our cause in the War of the Revolution, and only succeeded in the War of the Rebellion because the resources at his command were limitless as compared with those of the enemy. It was late in the afternoon when our boat shoved off, and as we steamed away we saw the citizens rush down and take possession of the stores left on the wharf. During the evening and night we were fired into several times from the shores, but these attacks were returned from the gunboat, which kept our assailants at such distance that their shots were harmless. We must have no lights that night, and the fires were put out or concealed, that they might not make us a target. So I slept, as there was nothing to be done, but in the morning was out early in search of worms, and was having good success, when 2 richly, fashionably dressed ladies came to tell me there was to be nothing to eat, save for those who took board at the captain's table. They had gone to the kitchen to make a cup of tea for a wounded officer, and were ignominiously driven off by the cook. What was to be done? We might be 10 days getting to Washington. I went in search of a surgeon in charge, and found one in bed, sick, waited at his door until he joined me, when together we saw the captain of the boat. There were 2 new cook stoves on board, but to put one up would be to forfeit the insurance. There were plenty of commissary stores. The surgeon went with me, ordered the commissary to give me anything I wanted, and went back to bed. Our stores consisted of crackers, coffee, dried apples, essence of beef, and salt pork in abundance, a little loaf bread, and about half a pound of citric acid. Of these, only the crackers and bread could be eaten without being cooked. There were 450 wounded men, all bad cases, all exhausted from privation. How many of them would live to reach Washington on a diet of crackers and water? I went to the cook, a large, sensible colored woman, and stated the case as well as I could. After hearing it, she said, "I see how it is, but you see all these officers and ladies are going to board with the captain, and I'll have a sight of cooking to do. I can't have none of those fine ladies coming a-bothering around me, carrying off my things or upsetting 'em. But I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll hurry up my work and clear off my things, then you can have the kitchen, you and that young lady that's with you. But them women with their hoops and their flounces must stay out of here." It was hard to see how 2 of them would get into that small domain, a kitchen about 10 feet square, half filled up by a cook stove, shelves, and the steep, narrow, open stairs which led to the upper deck. But what a kingdom that little kitchen was to me! All the utensils leaked, but cook helped me draw rags through the holes in the 3 largest which I was to have, and which covered the top of the stove. There were plenty of new wooden buckets and tin dippers on board as freight, some contraband women, and an active little man who had once been a cook's assistant. He and the women were glad to work for food. He was to help me in the kitchen. We worked outside and must not get in the way of the crew. They washed dried apples and put them to soak in buckets, pounded crackers in bags and put the crumbs into buckets, making each one a third full and covering them with cold water. I put a large piece of salt pork into my largest boiler, added water and beef essence enough to almost fill the boiler, seasoned it, and as soon as it reached boiling point, had it ladled into the buckets with the cracker crumbs and sent for distribution. The second boiler was kept busy cooking dried apples, into which I put citric acid and sugar, for gangrene prevailed among the wounds. In the third boiler I made coffee. I kept it a soak, and as soon as it boiled I put it strong into buckets, 1/3 full of cold water. I kept vessels in the oven and on the small spaces on top of the stove. My little man fired up like a fire king, another man laid plenty of wood at hand, and I think that was the only cook stove that was ever run to its full capacity for a week. By so running it, I could give every man a pint of warm soup and one of warm coffee every 24 hours. To do this, everything must come to time. When one piece of pork was cooked, it was cut into small pieces and distributed, and another put into the boiler. During our cooking times, I usually sat on the stairs where I could direct and be out of the way, and to improve the time, often had a plate and cup from which I ate and drank. Cook always saved me something nice, and I made tea for myself. I was running my body as I did the cook stove, making it do quadruple duty, and did not spare the fuel in either case. Around each foot, below the instep, I had a broad, firm bandage, one above each ankle and one below each knee. If soldiers on the march had adopted this precaution, they would have escaped the swollen limbs so often distressing. I also had each knee covered by several layers of red flannel to protect them while I knelt on damp places. Soon after going into Campbell, I discovered that muscles around the bone will do double service if held firmly in place, and so was enabled in all my hospital work to do what seemed miraculous to the most experienced surgeons. I rested every moment I could, never stood when I might sit, made no useless motions, spent no strength in sorrow, had no sentiment, was simply the engineer of a machine, my own body, could fall asleep soon as I lay down, and wake any moment with my senses all alert, outlived my prejudice about china cups, and drank tea from brown earthen mugs used for soup, and never washed save in cold water, often ate from a tin plate with my left hand, while my right hand held a stump to prevent that jerking of the nerves which is so agonizing to the patient, many a time eating from the same tin plate with my patient, and making merry over it, and think I must have outstanding engagements to dance cotillions with 100 one-legged men. One day, while I sat eating and watching, that just enough cans of beef were put into each boiler of broth, and no time wasted by letting it stand after reaching boiling point, a surgeon asked to see me at the kitchen door. He informed me that up on the forecastle some men had had soup twice, while those in some other place had had none. He evidently wished to be lenient, but felt that I had been guilty of great neglect. I heard his grievance and said, "Doctor, how many of you surgeons are on this boat?" After some consideration, he answered, 4. 4 surgeons, I repeated, beside the surgeon in charge, who is sick. We have 450 wounded men. I draw all the rations, find a way to cook them, have them cooked, and put into the buckets, ready for distribution. Do you not think that you 4 could organize a force to see that they are honestly distributed? Or do you expect me to be in the kitchen, up in the forecastle, and at the stern on the boiler deck at one and the same time? Doctor, could you not take turns in amusing those ladies? Could they not spare 2 of you for duty? I heard no more complaints, but left Miss Gray more in charge of the kitchen, and did enough medical inspecting to know that I had been unjust. Some of the surgeons had been on duty, and the men were not so much neglected as I had feared. As for the ladies, I do not know how many there were of them, but they were of good social position, quite as good as the average of those whose main object in life is to look as much better than their neighbors as circumstances will admit. There was on board one of those folks for whose existence Christianity is responsible, and which sensible Hindus reduce to their original elements, namely, a widow who gets a living by being pious, and is respectable through sheer force of cheap finery, one who estimates herself by her surroundings, and whose every word and look and motion is an apology for her existence. She was a Dix, or paid nurse. The ladies snubbed her. We had no room for her hoops, and she spent her time in odd corners taking care of them and her hair, and turning up her eyes like a duck in a thunderstorm, under the impression that it looked devotional. If I had killed all the folks I have felt like killing, she would have gone from that boat to her final rest. One night about 11 o'clock, a strange surgeon who had just come aboard with 20 wounded came to the kitchen door and handed in a requisition for tea and custard and chicken for his men. The man told him he could have nothing but cracker broth or coffee. He was very indignant and proceeded to get up a scene, but the man said firmly, "Can't help it, surgeon. That's the orders." "Orders? Whose orders?" I got down from my perch on the stairs, came forward and said, "It is my orders, sir, and I am sorry, but this is really all we can do for you. If your men have tin cups, each one can have a cup of warm soup. It will not be very hot, or a cup of warm coffee. Those who get soup will get no coffee, and those who get coffee can have no soup. You can get tin cups from the commissary, and should have them ready, so that the food will not cool." While I made this statement, he stood regarding me with ineffable disdain, and when I was through, inquired, "Who are you?" "I am the cook." "The cook?" he repeated contemptuously. "I will report your insolence when we reach Washington." "That may be your duty, but I will send up the coffee and soup, and do you get the tin cups." He stamped off in dudgeon, and others who heard him were highly indignant, but I was greatly pleased to find a surgeon who would get angry. and raise a disturbance on behalf of his patients. I never knew his name, but if this should meet his eye, I trust he will accept my thanks for his faithfulness to his charge. On the lower deck behind the boilers lay 20 wounded prisoners, who at first looked sulky, but as I was stepping over and among them, one caught my dress and looked up pleadingly and said, "Mother, can't you get me some soft bread? I can't eat this hardtack." He was young, scarce more than a boy, had large dark eyes, a good head, tokens of gentle nurture, and alas, a thigh stump. He told me he was of a Mississippi regiment and his name Willie Gibbs. I bathed his hot face and said I would see about the bread, then went to another part of the deck where our men were very closely packed, and stated the case to them. There was very little soft bread. It was theirs by right. What should I do? I think they all spoke at once, and all said the same words. "Oh, Mother, give the Johnnies the soft bread. We can eat hardtack." I think I was impartial, but there was a temptation to give Willie Gibbs a little more than his share of attention. His face was so sad, and there was so little hope that he would ever again see those who loved him, that I think I did more for him than for any other one on board. His companions came to call me Mother, and I hope felt their captivity softened by my care, and often rebel hands supported me while I crouched at work. When we approached Washington, I proposed rewarding the cook for the incalculable service she had rendered, but she replied, "No, ma'am, I will not take anything from you, 'cept that apron. When we get to Washington, you will not want it any more, and I'll keep it all my life to remember you, and leave it to my children. Lord, there isn't another lady in the world could have done what you've done, and I know you're a lady. Them women with the fine clothes is trying to pass for ladies, but Lord, I know no lady'd dress up that way in a place like this, and men know it too. Just look at you, and how you do make them fellers in shoulder straps stand round." Her observation showed her Southern culture, for whatever supremacy the North may have over the South, Southern ladies are far in advance of those of the North in the art of dress. A Southern lady seldom commits an incongruity, or fails to dress according to age, weather, and the occasion. I do not think any one of any social standing would have gone among wounded men with the idea of rendering any assistance, tricked out in finery, as hundreds, if not thousands, of respectable Northern women did. The apron which I gave to my friend the cook was brown gingham, had seen hard service, and cost originally 10 cents and half an hour's hand sewing. But if it aids her to remember me as pleasantly as I do her, it is part of a bond of genuine friendship. End of chapter 76. Chapter 77 of Half a Century by Jane Grey SWISSHELM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Try to get up a society and get sick. After 2 days in bed at home, I was so much better that when Mrs. Ingersoll came with a plan for organizing a society to furnish the army with female nurses, I went to see Mrs. Lincoln about it. She was willing to cooperate, and I went to Secretary Stanton, who heard me and replied, "You must know that Mrs. Barlow and Mrs. Ingersoll and you are not fair representatives of your sex," and went on to explain the embarrassment of the Surgeon General from the thousands of women pressing their services upon the government, and the various political influences brought to bear on behalf of applicants, and of the well-grounded opposition of surgeons to the presence of women in hospitals on account of their general unfitness. General Scott, as a personal friend of Miss Dix, had appointed her to the place she held, and it was so convenient and respectful to refer people to her that the War Department would not interfere with the arrangement. In other words, she was a breakwater against which feminine sympathies could dash and splash without submerging the hospital service. After what I had seen among the women who had succeeded in getting in, I had not much to say. A society might prescribe a dress, but might be no more successful than Miss Dix in making selections of those who should wear it. I asked the secretary how it came, that no better provision had been made for our wounded after the Battle of the Wilderness, and tears sprang to his eyes as he replied, "We did not know where they were. We had made every arrangement at the points designated by General Grant, but he changed his plans and did not notify us. The whole army was cut off from its base of supplies and must be sustained. As soon as we knew the emergency, we did everything in our power, but all our preparations were lost. Everything had to be done over again. You cannot regret the suffering more than I, but it was impossible for me to prevent it." I never saw him so earnest, so sorrowful, so deeply moved. That effort seemed to be the straw which broke the camel's back, and I was so ill as to demand medical attendance. For this I sent to Campbell. Dr. Kelly came, but his forte was surgery, and my case was left with Dr. True, who had had longer practice in medicine. They both decided that I had been inoculated with gangrene while dressing wounds, and for some weeks I continued to sink. I began to think my illness fatal, and asked the doctor, who said, "I have been thinking I ought to tell you that if you have any unsettled business, you should attend to it." I had a feeling of being generally distributed over the bed, of being a mass of pulp without any central force. But I had had a letter that day from my daughter, who was with her father and grandmother in Swissvale, and wanted to come to me, and the thought came, does God mean to make my child an orphan, that others may receive their children by my death? Then I had a strange sensation of a muster, a gathering of scattered life force, and when it all came together it made a protest. I signed to the doctor, who put his ear to my lips, and I said, "Dr. True, I shall live to be 120 years old." He took up the lamp, threw the light on my face, and peered anxiously into it, and I looked straight into his eyes and said, "I will." He laughed and set down the lamp, saying, "Then you must get over this." "You must get me over it. Bring Dr. Kelly." Next morning I had them carry me into a larger room, where the morning sun shone on me, and 10 days after started for Pennsylvania, where I spent 3 weeks with my old Swissvale neighbors, Colonel Hawkins and William S. Haven. When I returned to Washington, I found an official document, a recommendation from the Quartermaster General of my dismissal for absence without leave. It was addressed to Secretary Stanton, who had written on the outside, "Respectfully referred to Mrs. SWISSHELM by Edwin M. Stanton." I went back to work and learned that Mrs. General Barlow had died of typhoid fever in Washington. No man died more directly for the government. Thousands who fell on the battlefield exhibited less courage and devotion to that service, and did less to secure its success. I know not where her body lies, but wherever it does, no Decoration Day should pass in which her memory is not crowned with immortelles. She died at a time when my life was despaired of, and when Mrs. Ingersoll wrote to a Maine paper of my illness, adding, "I hope the Lord will not take her away until he has made another like her." She told me afterwards that just then she held the world at a grudge, and it must have been relieved of my presence long ere this, if I had not found in homeopathy relief from pain, which for 8 months made life a burden, and for which the best old school physicians proposed no cure. End of chapter 77. Chapter 78 of Half a Century by Jane Grey SWISSHELM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. An efficient nurse. To show the capabilities of some of the women who thought they had a mission for saving the country by acting as hospital nurses, I give the history of one. While I lay ill, a friend came and told of a most excellent woman who had come from afar and tendered her services to the government, who had exerted much influence and spent much effort to get into a hospital as nurse, but had failed. Hearing of my illness, her desire to be useful led her to tender her services, so that if she could not nurse wounded soldiers, she could nurse one who had. The generous offer was accepted, and I was left an afternoon in her care. I wanted a cup of tea. She went to the kitchen to make it, and 1 hour after came up with a cup of tea, only this and nothing more, save a saucer. To taste the tea I must have a spoon, and to get one she must go along a hall, down a long flight of stairs, through another hall and the kitchen to the pantry. When she had made the trip, the tea was so much too strong that a spoonful would have made a cup. She went down again for hot water, and after she had got to the kitchen remembered that she had thrown it out, thinking it would not be wanted. The fire had gone out, and she came up to inquire if she should make a new one, and if so, where she should find kindling. She had spent almost 2 hours running to and fro, was all in perspiration and a fluster, had done me a great deal of harm and nobody any good, had wasted all the kindlings for the evening fire, enough tea to have served a large family for a meal, and fairly illustrated a large part of the hospital service rendered by women oppressed with the nursing mission. My sense of relief was inexpressible when Mrs. George B. Lincoln returned from her visit to the White House, sent my tea maker away, and took charge of me once more. End of chapter 78. Chapter 79 of Half a Century by Jane Grey SWISSHELM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. To Fredericksburg Patients. Some months after leaving Fredericksburg, I was walking on Pennsylvania Avenue when the setting sun shone in my face and a man in uniform stopped me, saying, "Excuse me, do you not know me, but I know you?" I turned, looked at him carefully, and said, "I do not know you." "Oh, no, but the last time you saw me, you cut off my beard with your scissors and fed me with a teaspoon. When you left me, you did not think you would ever see me again." "Oh," I exclaimed joyfully, "you are Dutton." He laughed and replied, "That's me. I have just got a furlough and am going home." He was very pale and thin, but I was so glad to see him and shake hands and wish him safely home with his friends. During the great review after the war, I had a seat near the President's stand. There was a jam, and a man behind me called my attention to a captain at a short distance who had something to say to me, and passed along the words, "You took care of me on the boat coming from Fredericksburg." Looking across, I could see him quite well, but even when his hat was off, could not recognize him, and this is all I ever heard from or of the men with whose lives mine was so knit during that terrible time. I fear that not many survived, and I doubt if a dozen of them ever knew me by any other name than that of Mother. End of chapter 79. Chapter 80 of Half a Century by Jane Grey SWISSHELM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Am Enlightened. When Early appeared before Washington, we all knew there was nothing to prevent his coming in and taking possession. The forts were stripped. There were no soldiers either in or around the city. The original inhabitants were ready to welcome him with open arms. The departments were closed, that the clerks might go out in military array to a post, but of course few soldiers were sitting at desks at that stage of the war. The news at the quartermaster's office one morning was that the foreign ministers had been notified, and that the city would be shelled that afternoon. We lived on the north side of the city, and when I went home, thousands of people were on the streets listening to the sound of guns at Fort Reno. So far as I knew, there was a universal expectation that the city would be occupied by rebel troops that night. As this was in harmony with the general tenor of my anticipations for a quarter of a century, I readily shared in the popular opinion and for once was with the majority. Among the groups who stood on the streets were many contrabands, and their faces were pitiful to see. One scantily clad woman, holding a ragged infant and with two frightened, ragged children clinging to her skirts, stood literally quaking. Her black face had turned gray with terror, and she came to me and asked, "Oh, missus, does he tink they will get in?" Suddenly my eyes were opened, like those of the prophet's servant when he saw the horses and chariots of fire, and I replied, "No, never, they will never come no nearer than they now are. You can go home and rest in peace, for you are just as safe from them as if you were in heaven." She was greatly comforted, but a gentleman said, as she moved away, "I wish I could share your opinion, but what is to hinder their coming in?" "God is to hinder. He has appointed us to rescue these people. They are collected here in thousands, and the prayers of centuries are to be answered now." I myself went home, feeling all the confidence I spoke, and wondering I could have been so stupid as to doubt. Our government and people were very imperfect, but had developed a sublime patriotism, made an almost miraculous growth in good. 10 righteous men would have saved Sodom. We had 10,000, and I must think there are few histories of supernatural interference in the affairs of the Jews more difficult to account for on merely natural grounds than the preservation of Washington in that crisis. End of chapter 80. Chapter 81 of Half a Century by Jane Grey SWISSHELM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Conclusion. December 6th, 1865, the 50th anniversary of my birth, found me in Washington at work in the quartermaster's office on a salary of $60 a month, without any provision for support in old age, and so great a sufferer as never to have a night of rest unbroken by severe pain, but with my interest in a country rescued from the odium of Southern slavery, and a faint light breaking of the day which is yet to abolish that of the West. In the summer of '66, Dr. King of Pittsburgh came to know what I would take for my interest in 10 acres of the Swissvale estate which he had purchased. My deed had presented a barrier to the sale of a portion of it, and he was in trouble. I consulted Secretary Stanton, who said, "Your title to that property is good against the world." It had become valuable, and the idea of its ownership was alarming. I had made up my mind to poverty, had been discharged from the quartermaster's office by special order of President Johnson for speaking disrespectfully of the President of the United States. Washington Star. Was the first person dismissed by Mr. Johnson, was without visible means of support, could not suddenly adjust my thought to anything so foreign to all my plans as coming into possession of a valuable estate, and said, "Oh, Secretary Stanton, how shall I ever undertake such a stewardship at my time of life?" He looked sternly at me and replied, "Mrs. SWISSHELM, don't be a fool. Take care of yourself. It is time you would begin. The property is yours now. You are morally responsible for it, and can surely make some better use of it than giving it away to rich men around Pittsburgh. Go at once and attend to your interests." This was our last interview. I instituted the suit he advised, and he would have pled my cause before the Supreme Court, but when it came up, he was holding possession of the War Department to defeat President Johnson's policy of making the South triumphant. However, the decree of the court was in my favor, and through it I have been able to rescue the old log block house from the tooth of decay, and to sit in it and recall those passages of life with which it is so intimately connected. End of chapter 81. Recording by Pamela Nagami, M.D., in Encino, California, June 2018. End of Half a Century by Jane Grey SWISSHELM.